There is a particular kind of man that history tends to overlook, not because he was unimportant, not because what he did failed to matter, but because he stood beside someone louder, someone more mythologized, someone whose name became the shorthand for an entire era. Ivan Konev was that man. He stood in the long shadow cast by Georgy Zhukov, by Stalin himself, by the sheer overwhelming scale of the war the Soviet Union fought, and, against every reasonable expectation, survived. And yet, if you pull back the curtain, if you set aside the monuments and the propaganda posters and the carefully curated Soviet memory of the Second World War, what you find is something far more interesting than a footnote. What you find is a man, a boy first, born into the mud and cold of rural Russia in 1894, in a world that still ran on the rhythms of the Tsar's empire, a world where peasant children did not become generals, where the son of a provincial family did not reshape the borders of Europe, where ambition without connections was simply noise, unheard and unrewarded. And yet Ivan Konev would go on to command more than 1 million soldiers. He would drive German forces from Ukrainian soil, cross rivers that military theorists called uncrossable, and plant Soviet banners in the rubble of cities that had once been promised eternal protection by the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. He did not do it cleanly. He did not do it without failure, without cost, without the particular weight of decisions that haunt a commander long after the guns fall silent. He made catastrophic errors in the early years of the war. He watched colleagues disappear into Stalin's purges and calculated, with cold precision, how to remain standing when those around him fell. He fought battles that cost more lives than most nations committed to their entire war effort, and he fought them knowing that retreating was not an option, not militarily, not politically, not if he wanted to survive. That is what makes Ivan Konev worth understanding. We live in an age of simplified heroes. We prefer our great men unambiguous, our villains cartoonish, our history arranged into clean moral categories. But the Eastern Front of the Second World War was not clean. It was the largest, most destructive theater of conflict in recorded human history. More than 30 million Soviet citizens died before it was over. The scale of that loss is almost impossible to hold in the mind. And the men who commanded Soviet forces through that nightmare were shaped by it in ways that do not fit neatly into the heroic narratives we prefer. Konev was forged in that fire, not once, but repeatedly. He survived the chaos of the Russian Civil War, the paranoid machinery of Stalinist terror, the catastrophic opening months of Operation Barbarossa, and the grinding, merciless attrition of battles that consumed entire armies. Each time the war tried to break him, and it tried more than once, he absorbed what it was teaching him, adapted, and came back harder, sharper, and more dangerous than before. By the time he stood at the gates of Berlin in the spring of 1945, Ivan Konev was arguably the most complete operational commander on any side of the conflict. Not the most famous, not the most celebrated, but the most complete. A man who had built his understanding of modern warfare from the ground up, through failure and revision and ruthless self-examination, over more than 3 years of industrial-scale combat. This documentary is his story, not the sanitized version, not the version carved into Soviet monuments or printed in Cold War-era military histories with their ideological varnish intact. This is the full account, the early struggles, the near disasters, the brutal lessons of Rzhev, the political maneuvering that sat just beneath the surface of every battlefield decision, and the final extraordinary drive that brought his forces to the heart of the collapsing Third Reich. We are going to trace his life from that small provincial town in Imperial Russia, through the chaos of revolution and civil war, through the terrifying years when Stalin's purges made survival itself a form of achievement. We are going to follow him through the darkest months of Barbarossa, when Soviet forces were losing ground faster than maps could be redrawn, and we are going to watch him transform, slowly, painfully, without guarantee, into one of the defining military figures of the 20th century. Along the way, we will meet the world that made him, the Russia of the Tsars, crumbling under its own weight, the Red Army of the 1930s, brilliant in its revolutionary ambition and crippled by the very ideology that animated it, the Wehrmacht of 1941, a force of staggering operational sophistication that nonetheless underestimated what it was driving into, and the Soviet military machine of 1944 and 1945, rebuilt from catastrophe into something the world had never quite seen before, vast, coordinated, and relentless. If you are watching this now, settling in for the night, looking for something that will carry you gently but meaningfully through the hours ahead, then welcome. This channel exists for exactly this moment. Long, careful, deeply researched documentaries about the people and events that shape the world we live in. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more waiting for you, and this kind of history, the kind that takes its time, that respects both the subject and the audience, is what we do. For those of you who have been here before, you already know what we are building toward. So settle in, get comfortable, let this one breathe. Because Ivan Konev's story does not begin with triumph. It begins, as all the most honest stories do, with hardship. With a child in a cold corner of a vast empire, looking out at a world that had not yet decided what it would become, a world in motion, unstable at its foundations, pressing towards something that no one alive in 1894 could fully anticipate. From that beginning, through revolution and war and terror and the largest military conflict in human history, we are going to follow one man's journey to the very edge of everything, and watch him, against the odds, come back from it. This is the untold history of Ivan Konev, Soviet Marshal, battlefield commander, survivor, and a man whose story, once you know it, is very difficult to forget. There is a village in the far north of Russia where the winters arrive without ceremony and stay without apology. Lode Neue Pole sits on the eastern bank of the Svir River, a place of timber and cold water, and skies that press down close in the months of darkness. The forests there are old and deep, and the people who live among them carry a particular quality, a self-sufficiency born not from pride but from necessity, from the simple arithmetic of survival in a landscape that offers little comfort and asks much in return. It was here, in the year 1894, that Ivan Stepanovich Konev was born into a peasant family with no reason to expect that the world beyond those forests would ever concern itself with him. The Russian Empire stretched for thousands of miles in every direction, vast and indifferent, its power concentrated in the palaces of St. Petersburg and the counting houses of Moscow, far removed from a child born to working people in a river town most maps ignored. History, at the moment of his birth, had no particular plans for him. It rarely does for the people who go on to shape it. The Russia into which he arrived was a country living on borrowed time, though no one had yet agreed on how much remained. Tsar Alexander III had spent his reign pulling the empire tighter, suppressing dissent, enforcing orthodoxy, and insisting on a vision of Russia that was increasingly at war with the forces reshaping the wider world. The great wave of industrialization that had remade Britain and France and Germany was now washing against Russia's borders, dragging peasant communities into mill towns and factory districts, dissolving old certainties, and creating new classes of people with new kinds of grievances. The peasantry, which was to say most of Russia, existed in a legal and economic condition only recently separated from outright serfdom. The emancipation of 1861 had granted freedom in name while leaving millions bound by debt, by communal land tenure, and by taxation that made genuine independence a fantasy. A boy born to this world in 1894 was born into a social order that was, in the most literal sense, preparing to destroy itself. He simply did not yet know that he would be one of the instruments of its destruction. Konev's early years followed the patterns familiar to most children of his station. The rhythms of the northern agricultural calendar were absolute. The brief, intense summers demanded labor from everyone old enough to contribute, and the long winters imposed their own discipline of cold and conservation and waiting. Education in provincial Russia at the turn of the century was neither reliable nor particularly ambitious in what it sought to accomplish. Village schools existed to produce functional literacy and basic numeracy, to instill a knowledge of orthodox doctrine, and to send children back into the fields and workshops where they were needed. That Konev absorbed something more from his schooling, a genuine appetite for reading, a capacity for rigorous thinking, says as much about the particular quality of his mind as it does about his circumstances. The children who emerge hungry from limited educations are often the most formidable students, because they understand from early experience that knowledge is not a given but something seized. The social texture of Lodenoy Pole was shaped by the timber trade that formed the economic spine of the region. The Svir River connected the interior to Lake Ladoga and ultimately to the broader networks of Russian commerce, and so the town existed in a state of contact with the wider world that purely agricultural settlements did not enjoy. Merchants came through, and news came with them. Labor organizers, when they dared, moved along these same waterways, carrying ideas that the Tsar's government classified as dangerous, and that working men and women received with complicated mixtures of hope, fear, and hungry interest. The great strikes and upheavals of early 20th century Russia were not abstractions in a place like Lodenoy Pole. They were reported in fragments, passed between workers, debated in the low voices people use when they suspect they are being listened to. A perceptive child, growing up in this environment, would have absorbed a great deal about the relationship between power and those who lack it. The death of Alexander III in 1894, the very year of Konev's birth, brought his son Nicholas II to the throne, and with him a particular quality of tragic inadequacy that would define the final decades of the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas was not a cruel man in the way that some rulers are cruel. He was something arguably more dangerous, a man of limited capacity, installed at the apex of a system that demanded extraordinary judgment, who genuinely believed that his absolute authority was divinely ordained, and therefore that questioning it constituted a kind of blasphemy. His reign would see Russia into a catastrophic war with Japan, through the convulsions of the Revolution of 1905, into the First World War, and finally into the collapse that ended the empire entirely. For the boy growing up beside the Svir River, these events would arrive in sequence across his childhood and adolescence, each one tightening the coil of historical pressure that would eventually release with shattering force. The Revolution of 1905 arrived when Konev was 11 years old, young enough to absorb its emotional charge without fully comprehending its political architecture. The triggers were multiple and converging: the humiliating defeat by Japan, the massacre of peaceful petitioners outside the Winter Palace in January of that year, the grinding poverty that industrial expansion had intensified rather than relieved. What erupted was not yet a revolution in the sense of a complete transfer of power, but it was something that felt revolutionary to those who experienced it. Strikes across the country, the formation of Soviets or workers' councils in the cities, mutinies in the military, and a Tsar sufficiently shaken that he issued concessions he had no genuine intention of honoring. For young Russians of Konev's generation, the lesson embedded itself deeply, that the state's power, however overwhelming it appeared, was not immovable, and that organized collective action could, under the right conditions, make the immovable shift. There is a quality that distinguishes the commanders who survive and adapt from those who break or stagnate, and that quality has something to do with the relationship between imagination and discipline. Imagination without discipline produces chaos. Discipline without imagination produces rigidity. The best military minds combine both, the capacity to envision what has not yet happened alongside the mental architecture to plan for it, with methodical precision. It is impossible to know with certainty what Konev's inner life looked like in these early years, but the man who would later coordinate the movements of enormous armies across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain was already, presumably, a person who saw patterns where others saw only confusion. The forests and rivers of his childhood, the social and political turbulence of his adolescence, may well have been the conditions under which that particular capacity was first developed. His path toward formal military training was not inevitable. Many men of his background and generation found their way into industrial labor or remained tied to agricultural communities. What drew Konev specifically toward military service was likely the compound of factors that draws young men of ability from limited circumstances toward institutions that promise structure, advancement, and a kind of significance the village cannot offer. The army, even in its Tsarist form, was a world where performance could, at least in principle, outweigh the accident of birth. The military schools of the period offered a technical education of genuine quality, training in engineering, logistics, and tactical thinking that went considerably beyond what civilian provincial education could provide. For a young man with intellectual ambition and limited resources, the uniform represented a transaction, discipline and loyalty given in exchange for formation and opportunity. The experience of military training in the final years of the Tsarist system would have placed Konev inside a contradiction he could not yet fully name. He was being formed by an institution that belonged to an order he would eventually help to destroy, trained in methods and traditions that carried the assumptions of that order embedded within them. Yet the technical skills being imparted, map reading, command structure, logistics, the translation of tactical intention into organized movement, were not ideological in themselves. They could be transferred, adapted, refitted for a different kind of army, serving a different kind of state. Many of the men who would build the Red Army came from exactly this background, trained by the old order, radicalized by its failures, and capable of bringing their technical formation across the divide of revolution, because skill, unlike allegiance, is portable. The Russia that Konev was preparing to serve in the years immediately before the First World War was a country in the grip of accelerating contradictions. Industrial output was rising dramatically even as the conditions of industrial workers remained desperate. The political reforms forced by the Revolution of 1905 had produced a parliament, the Duma, whose actual power the Tsar systematically undermined. Revolutionary movements of every stripe, socialist, anarchist, nationalist, competed for the allegiance of the discontented, conducting their arguments in illegal pamphlets and coded conversations. The Orthodox Church and the aristocracy held their positions with increasing desperation, aware that the ground was shifting beneath them, but incapable of imagining any arrangement of things that did not place them at its center. A young officer moving through this environment was navigating a world of surface stability and subterranean instability, and he would have needed considerable care and self-possession to do so without attracting the wrong kind of attention. What is striking, looking backward from the vantage of all that followed, is how thoroughly the circumstances of Konev's formation prepared him for the extraordinary demands that history would eventually make on him. The poverty that produced resilience, the political violence that produced clear-eyed pragmatism, the technical education that produced professional competence. These were not accidental attributes. They were the specific harvest of a specific kind of Russian life at a specific historical moment, and they equipped him for the particular requirements of the brutal and extraordinary decades that were coming. He could not see them coming. He stood at the beginning of his story with no view of the chapters ahead. But the man who would one day stand at the gates of Berlin was already being assembled, quietly, beside a cold northern river, by conditions that asked everything of the people they produced. Russia in 1917 was not a country collapsing. It was a country detonating. The Tsar had fallen. The provisional government had failed, and into the vacuum rushed a force that offered the desperate, the idealistic, and the ruthless a single, burning purpose. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October of that year, they did not inherit a state. They inherited a ruin, surrounded on all sides by enemies who intended to finish what history had started. For a young man from Lodinoy Pole, raised in the cold pragmatism of peasant life and tempered by the grinding discipline of imperial military service, the choice was not complicated. The revolution was the only institution still moving forward. Ivan Konev stepped toward it. He joined the Red Army in its earliest, most precarious form, when it was less an army and more an argument held together by revolutionary fever and the threat of execution. The Bolsheviks had inherited almost nothing functional from the old imperial military structure. What they had was manpower, young men from villages and factory floors who believed, or were persuaded to believe, that the cause justified the sacrifice. Organization was improvised. Command structures were invented week by week. Political commissars stood at the shoulders of officers, watching for hesitation, watching for doubt, watching for any sign that loyalty might bend under pressure. Into this volatile institution, Konev arrived not as a passive recruit, but as a junior commander, a man expected to lead before he had fully learned what leading meant. The Russian Civil War, which burned from roughly 1917 through the early 1920s, bore almost no resemblance to the industrialized slaughter of the trenches that had just ended in Europe. This was warfare without fixed front lines, without reliable supply chains, without the orderly grammar of conventional military operations. The Red Army, the Bolsheviks' armed force, faced the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, foreign-backed factions, and dispossessed officers who despised everything the revolution stood for. Between them moved peasant militias, anarchist bands, nationalist movements, and forces loyal to no ideology beyond survival. The map of conflict shifted constantly, unpredictably, violently. A town held in the morning might change hands by nightfall. Allies became enemies. Enemies became reluctant partners. Loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and even that could be counterfeited. Konev served across theaters that demanded not specialization but flexibility. The campaigns across Siberia brought him into contact with some of the most punishing terrain and climate on the planet. distances so vast that supply and communication became their own form of warfare, separate from the fighting itself. Moving troops through Siberia was an exercise in logistics as much as tactics. Rail lines were contested, destroyed, and rebuilt. Food and ammunition were chronically scarce. The cold was not a seasonal inconvenience, but a permanent adversary that could reduce a regiment to a stumbling mass of frost-bitten men faster than any enemy offensive. Konev absorbed these realities, not as complaints, but as variables to be managed. He learned early that a commander who could not sustain his troops through harsh conditions had already lost, regardless of how sound his tactical thinking might be. In the Caucasus, the challenges were different, but equally demanding. The terrain shifted from mountain pass to valley floor, from dense forest to open steppe, requiring entirely different modes of movement and engagement. The populations encountered were not uniform in their sympathies. They were layered, tribal, suspicious of Moscow, as they had been suspicious of the Tsar before Moscow. Fighting here meant navigating local politics as much as enemy formations. A village might shelter Red Army soldiers one week and white partisans the next, not out of ideological conviction, but out of pure self-preservation. Konev observed all of this with the careful attention of a man who understood that the human terrain was as important as the physical one. He was building, though perhaps not yet consciously, a mental library of lessons that no military academy could have provided. What the Civil War taught above all else was the relationship between violence and authority. The Red Army during these years operated under a system of revolutionary discipline that was, by any conventional measure, extreme. Commanders who failed were not merely relieved. They were interrogated, sometimes shot. Desertion was treated as counter-revolution. Political reliability was assessed constantly by the commissars embedded in every unit. For a junior officer navigating this environment, the psychological demands were immense. Konev had to perform competence, demonstrate loyalty, manage the contradictions between military necessity and political expectation, and do all of this while actually fighting an enemy that was capable, brutal, and utterly unforgiving of weakness. The men who survived this system and advanced through it were not necessarily the most talented in a conventional sense. They were the most adaptable and the most pragmatic about the cost of their own survival. There was another dimension to these years that would mark Konev permanently. He witnessed at close quarters what ideological warfare looks like when it strips away restraint. Atrocities were committed by both sides in the Civil War, against civilians, against prisoners, against communities deemed insufficiently loyal to one cause or another. The revolution had promised liberation and delivered, in many places, a different and more intimate form of terror. Konev was not sheltered from this. He moved through it. A man of his background, rooted in the peasant experience, familiar with hardship and injustice, might have found in these events a reason to question what he was serving. Instead, the record suggests something more complicated. A man who compartmentalized what he saw and redirected his energy into the one domain where he had real agency, his own performance as a military commander. Control what you can control. Master the thing in front of you. Survive. By the early 1920s, the Civil War was grinding toward the Bolsheviks' hard-fought victory. The White Army had not been decisively destroyed. It had simply been exhausted and fragmented, its foreign backers withdrawing support as the political will for intervention faded. What remained in Russia was a scarred, depleted nation and a Red Army that had won through sheer, brutal persistence. Konev emerged from these years not as a celebrated hero, but as something more durable, a proven officer, marked as reliable, tested under conditions that had broken many others. In the Soviet system, this kind of quiet, demonstrable competence carried weight that battlefield glory alone could not guarantee. He had not merely survived the crucible, he had passed through it with his capabilities intact and his reputation growing. His advancement through the early Red Army structure in the years that followed reflected this track record. He attended military education courses that the Bolsheviks were establishing with urgent ambition, determined to professionalize the force that had won the revolution through revolutionary will rather than military science. Konev proved an apt student, not because he approached doctrine with the reverence of an academic, but because he could test every theoretical proposition against the practical experience he carried from the Civil War's chaos. Where doctrine matched reality, he absorbed it. Where it did not, he filed the discrepancy, quietly, for future reference. This habit of mind, analytical, unsentimental, grounded in the actual, would become one of the defining characteristics of his command style as the years accumulated. Within the Red Army's evolving officer corps, Konev was one of a generation shaped by a unique and unrepeatable experience. They had come of age not in peacetime academies but in active, savage conflict. They had commanded men who had nothing, no reliable equipment, no secure supply, no certainty that the next order from above would make any tactical sense whatsoever. They had learned to improvise not as a supplementary skill, but as the primary one, and they had learned the political grammar of the Soviet military system, the importance of the commissar relationship, the necessity of visible ideological alignment, and the calculation involved in managing one's superior officers as carefully as one managed an enemy advance. These were not comfortable lessons. They were survival lessons. Konev had learned them well. What the Russian Civil War ultimately gave Ivan Konev was not a set of tactical templates to be replicated in future conflicts. The war was too chaotic, too particular, too unlike anything that would come after it for its specific lessons to transfer directly. What it gave him instead was something harder to quantify and more valuable, a fundamental tolerance for disorder, the capacity to function, to think clearly, to make decisions, to maintain the trust of the men around him, when the situation had disintegrated beyond any textbook's ability to describe it. In the years ahead, when German armor would tear through Soviet formations on a scale that made the Civil War's violence look provincial, this tolerance for disorder would be the quality that separated commanders who held together from commanders who broke apart. Konev had been built for chaos, in chaos, by chaos itself. The Red Army had given him his crucible. What he made of the metal inside it was entirely his own. There is a particular kind of fear that does not arrive like an artillery barrage, sudden, deafening, overwhelming. It seeps. It enters the corridors of Soviet military headquarters in the mid-1930s, the way winter cold enters an old building, slowly, through every crack, until the air inside becomes indistinguishable from the air outside. By 1937, that cold had settled permanently into the bones of the Red Army. Officers who had survived the Civil War, who had endured famine and revolution and the grinding labor of building a modern military from almost nothing, now faced something their training had never prepared them for. The enemy was not across a border. It wore the same uniform. It spoke the same language. And it arrived, usually, in the small hours of the morning. Stalin's Great Purge did not emerge from nowhere. The years leading up to 1937 had already seen waves of political violence directed at party officials, industrial managers, and perceived class enemies. But when the terror turned its full attention toward the military, It struck an institution that was simultaneously being modernized and destroyed. The Red Army in the early 1930s was a place of genuine intellectual ferment. New doctrines of deep battle and armored warfare were being developed, debated, and refined. Officers like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the brilliant military theorist who had championed mechanized warfare, were at the height of their influence. Then, in the spring of 1937, Tukhachevsky was arrested, tried on fabricated charges of conspiring with Nazi Germany, and shot. He was not alone. Within months, the purge consumed 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 division commanders. The numbers were so extreme they barely registered as human. Behind each one was a life, a career, a family, a circle of colleagues who now found their own names potentially compromised by mere association. Ivan Konev was 33 years old when the purge began its most ferocious phase. He was not yet famous. He had not yet commanded armies or won battles that would make history remember him. He was a mid-ranking officer, capable and politically reliable, working his way through the layers of a military bureaucracy that was being systematically hollowed out above him. In one sense, his relative obscurity offered some protection. He was not prominent enough to attract the particular scrutiny reserved for those who had accumulated power and influence. But obscurity was no guarantee of survival. Men were being arrested for offenses that had no rational definition. A former posting under a now condemned commander could be interpreted as evidence of a conspiracy. A private comment overheard and reported by an informant could become a confession extracted under duress. The charges were as varied as they were absurd, and the system that generated them had no interest in their accuracy. What the purge demanded of those who remained was a performance. Every officer still serving had to navigate a dual existence, continuing to do the practical work of military administration and command, while simultaneously demonstrating, at every moment, an unwavering ideological loyalty. Political commissars, who had long served alongside military officers as the party's representatives within the armed forces, gained enormous power during this period. Their reports could end a career or begin a prosecution. Every meeting, every exercise, every casual conversation carried the potential to be recorded and interpreted. Men stopped speaking frankly to their closest colleagues. Trust became a liability. The officer who confided his private doubts to a friend was placing both of them in danger. Silence was not merely a preference, it was a survival strategy refined through observation of who disappeared and who remained. Konev observed, "This is, perhaps, the essential fact about his survival through the terror. He was a student of his environment, with the same thoroughness he brought to studying enemy tactics. He watched how men fell. He noted the specific mistakes that attracted attention, the moment of unguarded speech, the failure to denounce a condemned colleague quickly enough, the slight hesitation in praising the latest party directive. He absorbed these lessons not as cynicism, but as necessity. A man who understood the rules of his environment, however irrational those rules might be, stood a greater chance of living long enough to apply his skills somewhere useful. Konev did not become a zealot. He became precise. He said what was required, attended what was required, signed what was required, and kept the interior world of his doubts entirely to himself. The practical consequences of the purge reshaped everything around him. Positions that had been occupied by experienced officers suddenly became vacant, often without explanation. A file removed from a desk, a name erased from a duty roster, a chair left empty at a briefing that no one acknowledged or explained. Promotions accelerated in this emptied environment, not because competence was being rewarded, but because bodies were needed to fill the vacancies left by those who had been taken. Konev advanced through these gaps. It would be comfortable to describe this simply as opportunity, but that framing flattens a more uncomfortable truth. Every step upward in the purge years meant stepping into a position vacated by someone who had been arrested, tortured, or shot. The Red Army's new generation of commanders was built on a foundation of institutional trauma. Beyond the personal danger, Konev witnessed the broader damage the purge inflicted on Soviet military capability. The officers who had developed deep battle doctrine, who had championed mechanized warfare, and studied the campaigns of foreign armies with genuine intellectual rigor, these were precisely the men who disappeared. What replaced them was not a generation of equals, but a generation of survivors, many of whom had advanced not because of their strategic brilliance, but because they had demonstrated adequate political reliability at a moment when reliability was valued above competence. Training suffered. Exercises became theatrical, designed to demonstrate loyalty rather than test tactical thinking. Honest assessments of weaknesses were dangerous because weakness implied sabotage. The institution that Koenig served was consuming its own capacity to fight, in the middle of a decade when the likelihood of having to fight was increasing every year. Through these years, Konev also observed the mechanism of denunciation itself, how it worked, what it required, and what it revealed about the system that generated it. Officers denounced colleagues to protect themselves, to settle private grievances, or simply because the pressure of remaining silent became unbearable. Once a denunciation was made, the logic of the system almost always carried it forward. An arrest generated interrogations, and interrogations generated confessions, and confessions generated new names, and new names generated new arrests. The machinery had its own momentum, largely independent of any actual evidence of wrongdoing. To understand this was to understand something fundamental about the Soviet state, not as a coherent instrument of rational power, but as an organism generating and consuming fear in roughly equal measure. Stalin remained, throughout all of this, the fixed point around which everything orbited. His portrait hung in every office. His words were quoted in every political meeting. His approval was the ultimate currency in a system where all other values had become uncertain. Konev, like every senior officer of his generation, had to orient himself toward that fixed point with consistent, visible commitment. This was not, it should be understood, a simple matter of cowardice or opportunism. The men who survived the purge years were operating within a system that had removed almost every other option. Resistance meant death, and death meant nothing accomplished. The calculation that survival made future usefulness possible was not a comfortable one, but it was the calculation that kept men like Konev in the position to matter when the larger war finally arrived. By the late 1930s, the purge had begun to subside, not because the terror had achieved any legitimate purpose, but because it had nearly exhausted its supply of credible targets within the military. What remained of the Red Army's officer corps was diminished, traumatized, and deeply cautious. The habit of self-censorship had become automatic. The instinct to conceal private assessments from superiors, to report what was expected rather than what was observed, had been burned into men who would need to do exactly the opposite when commanding in battle. The damage would take years to fully manifest, and when it did, it would cost the Soviet Union in blood rather than in careers. Konev emerged from the terror years, changed in ways that are difficult to fully measure. The capacity for silence that had kept him alive would also make him, in some moments, a difficult man to know. The pragmatism he had refined would make him an effective commander, but also, at times, a hard one, willing to accept costs that more sentimental men might have hesitated over. Accustomed to a world where the gap between what was said officially and what was understood privately was simply one of the basic conditions of existence, he had learned to read the room with extraordinary precision, to calibrate his words to his audience, to hold his actual assessments in reserve until the moment when expressing them served some useful purpose. These were not the skills of a monster. They were the skills of a man shaped by a monstrous period. What the 1930s ultimately gave Konev was a particular kind of toughness, not the crude, performative hardness of men who had never been genuinely tested, but the quieter resilience of someone who had spent years calculating survival in an environment where the rules changed without notice and the consequences of error were absolute. He had watched the finest officers of his generation disappear. He had attended their political funerals, signed their formal denunciations if required, and continued to work. The war that was coming would demand everything he had learned and more. But first, it would demand something from a smaller country, across a frozen border to the northwest, a conflict that would prove, in its own brutal fashion, that the Red Army's problems ran even deeper than the Purge had created. The winter of 1939 arrived early across the Karelian Isthmus, draping the pine forests in a silence so complete that even the crows seemed reluctant to disturb it. Beneath that silence, two nations prepared for a war that the world expected to last no longer than a few weeks. The Soviet Union, with its vast armies and continental weight, would simply roll over tiny Finland, or so the thinking went in Moscow's planning rooms, in the offices of foreign military attachés, and in the newspapers of a dozen capitals watching from a cautious distance. The Red Army numbered in the millions. Finland's entire armed forces could have been swallowed by a single Soviet military district without leaving a visible trace. The arithmetic of the situation seemed so lopsided as to be almost embarrassing, and Soviet commanders prepared their maps and their orders with the quiet confidence of men who expected occupation duties to begin within days of the first artillery barrage. That confidence was, in almost every particular, catastrophically misplaced. And Ivan Konev, serving among those commanders as the weight of expectation settled over the Soviet enterprise in Finland, was about to receive an education that no military academy could have delivered. The war that began on the 30th of November 1939 bore almost no resemblance to what Soviet planners had imagined. Finnish forces fell back from the frontier as the Red Army crossed the border, but they did not collapse. They dissolved into the tree line. Moving through forests, Soviet soldiers found genuinely impenetrable, appearing without warning at the flanks and rears of columns that had no idea where the threat was coming from. Soviet units advanced along roads because there was almost nowhere else to go, and in doing so, they transformed themselves into targets. The forests offered no purchase for armored formations designed to operate across open steppe. Tanks that had been conceived as instruments of sweeping offensive power found themselves channeled into narrow corridors where a handful of Finnish soldiers with demolition charges could halt an entire column's advance for hours. The logistical system, which had been constructed around assumptions of rapid territorial gain, began showing fractures within the first week, as supply vehicles struggled through snowdrifts and commanders discovered that maps of the region bore only the loosest relationship to the terrain beneath their boots. Konev's role in the Winter War sits in a space that Soviet records were never particularly eager to illuminate fully. He operated within a command structure that was itself under enormous pressure, a structure shaken by the purges of the preceding years that had hollowed out the Red Army's senior leadership at precisely the moment those leaders were most needed. The officers who had survived the purge years had done so partly through a learned caution about speaking uncomfortable truths upward, and that institutional silence now compounded every tactical error with a second layer of failure, the failure to report honestly what was actually happening on the ground. Units claimed advances they had not made. Casualty figures moved through the bureaucratic machinery with creative adjustments. Commanders who reported difficulties risked being seen as deficient in revolutionary spirit rather than honest about operational reality. Konev had already learned, through the years navigating the terror, that the gap between what was true and what was safe to say could swallow a man whole. But watching that same gap play out on a battlefield, with real soldiers dying in real snow for the sake of falsified reports, forced that lesson into an entirely different register of understanding. The physical conditions of the campaign were, by any measure, extraordinary in their severity. Temperatures across the Karelian front dropped to levels that rendered equipment unreliable and men extraordinarily vulnerable, even before the Finns had fired a single shot. Engines seized, lubricants thickened into paste, soldiers issued with uniforms calibrated for cold rather than extreme cold discovered the distinction mattered enormously when the thermometer plunged past -30. Frostbite moved through Soviet units with a quiet efficiency that the Finnish defenders could only admire from a distance. Supply lines that stretched back across exposed terrain offered little shelter for the men tasked with keeping them open, and the doctrine of the Red Army, which placed enormous emphasis on offensive momentum, offered almost no guidance for what to do when the offensive had stalled and winter itself had become the primary adversary. Konev watched all of this with the methodical attention of a man who understood, even in the depths of a failing campaign, that he was accumulating knowledge he would eventually need. The Mannerheim Line, Finland's system of fortifications anchoring the defensive position across the Karelian Isthmus, proved to be less a physical barrier than a revelation about Soviet doctrine's gaps. The Red Army's approach to fortified positions leaned heavily on direct assault, on the weight of numbers and the shock of artillery applied frontally. Against prepared defences held by defenders who knew every metre of the ground behind them, that approach produced casualties on a scale that even the most optimistic Soviet commanders found difficult to absorb without some private reckoning. Men were sent forward in conditions where the mathematics of the assault were, in cold professional terms, essentially untenable. Konev, observing and participating in a command architecture that had not yet found a coherent answer to what Finland had posed as a question, began forming his own answers, quietly, methodically, in the private discipline that had kept him alive through the purge years and would now serve a very different purpose. Reorganization eventually came, not from within the command structures that had failed, but from Moscow's recognition that the situation demanded intervention. New commanders were brought forward. Doctrine was revised, at least in practice if not yet entirely in writing. Artillery was concentrated in quantities that suggested the Soviets had finally decided to treat the Mannerheim Line as the serious military problem it actually was, rather than the theoretical nuisance early planning had classified it as. The reorganized assault that eventually cracked Finland's defensive line came at a cost measured in human lives that the Soviet Union was not, at the time, inclined to publish openly. But it worked. The Finns, facing the reality of their position against an enemy willing to absorb losses of this magnitude, concluded terms in March of 1940. The war was over in 105 days, not the few weeks Moscow had imagined, and at a price that had shaken observers across Europe and beyond. What those observers saw, and what concerned them most, was a picture of Soviet military incompetence, so thorough and so consistent that many Western analysts concluded the Red Army had been permanently damaged by the purges. The Germans studied the Finnish campaign with particular care, and the conclusions they drew, that the Soviet military machine was brittle, poorly led, and incapable of coherent operational thought above the divisional level, would feed directly into the calculations behind Operation Barbarossa less than 2 years later. They were not entirely wrong about what they had seen in Finland. They were, however, wrong to believe that what they had seen was permanent, rather than a condition the Soviet system was actively, if brutally, correcting. Konev was one of the instruments of that correction, carrying his Finnish observations forward into everything he would do next. His capacity for honest self-assessment, rare enough in any army, but genuinely exceptional in one where self-criticism carried the risk of a one-way journey to somewhere cold and permanent, showed itself in how he processed the Winter War's failures. He did not look for scapegoats among his subordinates, though the Soviet system offered ample precedent and structural encouragement for exactly that approach. Instead, he looked at doctrine and found it insufficient. He looked at logistics and found it rigid in all the wrong places. He looked at intelligence, the assessments of Finnish strength, Finnish terrain, Finnish will to resist, and found it had been shaped more by what planners wished were true than by what observers had actually reported. These were not conclusions he would have announced in any formal setting, but they were conclusions that would quietly restructure the way he thought about the preparation and execution of military operations. The lessons of Finland sank into Konev with a weight proportionate to their cost. The absolute necessity of accurate terrain intelligence before committing forces to movement through unknown ground. This he had seen demonstrated in the negative by men who died because nobody had genuinely studied where they were being sent. The importance of genuine coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, not as an aspiration in doctrine documents, but as a practical reality tested in training before it was required in battle. This too he had watched fail in real time. And perhaps most significantly, the Finnish campaign taught him something about the relationship between time and preparation, that the pressure to move quickly, to demonstrate revolutionary momentum, to satisfy the impatience of political authority, could be more dangerous to an army than any enemy defense line. Patience in preparation was not timidity. It was the opposite of timidity. It was the discipline required to ensure that when force was applied, it was applied with the precision and weight that made the outcome something other than a catastrophe. By the time the terms with Finland were signed, and the Soviet Union turned its attention back toward the broader European situation, Konev had returned to his duties, carrying a compressed archive of operational experience that most officers never accumulate. The Finnish war had been a humiliation in the international assessment, and honestly, in his own. He had no interest in pretending otherwise to himself, even as the official narrative performed its necessary adjustments. What he had seen was what he had seen, and the man who emerged from that winter was measurably different from the man who had entered it. Not broken, not diminished, but recalibrated. The certainties he had carried into the campaign had been stripped away by contact with a reality that simply refused to cooperate with those certainties. In their place was something harder and more durable, a professional skepticism toward easy assumptions, a respect for the enemy's capacity to confound expectation, and a commitment to preparation so thorough that the gap between plan and reality would be reduced to something manageable, before the first shot was ever fired. None of this had come cheaply. The tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers who had died in Finnish snow had paid for it. Konev understood that accounting, and in a man of genuine professional seriousness, that understanding carries a specific kind of weight. Not guilt exactly, but a responsibility to ensure that what was paid for so dearly is actually used. The Finland of 1939 had made him a harder, more precise, more honest military thinker than he had been before. The world beyond Finland would, in less than 2 years, provide him with a stage enormous enough to discover whether that transformation was sufficient. There is a particular kind of quiet that descends on military institutions between wars. Not peace, exactly, but the uneasy stillness of men who know something is coming and cannot yet see its shape. In the years between 1939 and 1941, that quiet settled over the Soviet Union like frost on glass, cold and clarifying in equal measure. The world outside Soviet borders was burning. Poland had been carved apart. France had fallen in weeks. Britain stood alone across a narrow strip of water, battered and defiant. And Joseph Stalin, watching from behind the Kremlin walls with calculating eyes, understood that the agreement he had signed with Adolf Hitler was not a foundation, it was a postponement. He needed time. His army needed time. Ivan Stepanovich Konev, recently tested and sobered by the ice fields of Finland, understood this too. He carried the lessons of that brutal winter campaign, not as wounds to be buried, but as problems to be solved. The Finno-Soviet War had exposed the Red Army's skeleton with brutal clarity, a force whose officer corps had been surgically hollowed by purge and paranoia, whose logistical arteries ran clotted, and whose tactical doctrine had calcified into rigid forms that broke against improvised Finnish defences. Stalin and his generals knew what the world suspected. The Red Army was not yet the instrument its revolutionary mythology claimed it to be. The question driving every reform effort, every exercise, every staff college argument in those intervening months was ruthlessly simple. Could it become that instrument fast enough? Konev threw himself into this question with the intensity of a man who had watched capable colleagues vanish and mediocre survivors flourish, and who was determined that neither fate would be his. He was not a theorist by temperament, but a practitioner, and practice, he now understood, demanded a reckoning with everything the Finnish campaign had revealed. What followed throughout 1940 and into 1941 was the most ambitious military reform program in Soviet history. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko had replaced Kliment Voroshilov as People's Commissar of Defense following the Finnish disaster, and Timoshenko moved with urgency. Training standards were raised sharply. Discipline was tightened. The comfortable culture of self-congratulatory exercises, where scripted outcomes replaced genuine assessment, was formally condemned, though old habits die by degrees rather than by decree. New field regulations were drafted and distributed, incorporating lessons from Germany's campaigns in Poland and France. Konev absorbed these reforms not as a passive recipient, but as an active participant, commanding formations in the Transbaikal military district and later in the North Caucasus region, applying the new doctrine in training environments with the stubborn thoroughness that was becoming his signature. His assignment to these commands was itself a signal of the system's confidence in him, a quiet endorsement, communicated not through ceremony, but through the weight of responsibility attached to each posting. The Transbaikal district was vast and logistically demanding, separated from the European theatre by thousands of kilometers of steppe and taiga. Commanding there required a different kind of operational thinking. sustaining forces across distances that would have strained the imagination of most European commanders, coordinating with rail networks that ran thin and irregular, and planning for contingencies without the luxury of reinforcement close at hand. These were not glamorous assignments. They were grinding, administrative, institutionally unglamorous, and they built in Konev a logistical awareness that purely combat-oriented officers frequently lacked. Supply chains, fuel depots, ammunition stocks, railway timetables. These unglamorous essentials would later prove decisive on a continental scale. The war games of 1940 and 1941 cast a long and complicated shadow. The Soviet High Command conducted large-scale operational exercises designed to test both offensive and defensive doctrine against a hypothetical adversary that bore unmistakable resemblance to the Wehrmacht. Senior commanders were summoned to Moscow to present their operational plans, to argue doctrine in front of Stalin and the General Staff, and to defend conclusions under conditions that were intellectually demanding and politically treacherous in equal measure. Konev participated in these sessions. What emerged from the exercises was a portrait of tremendous theoretical capability, alongside equally tremendous practical fragility. Soviet forces, on paper, possessed the armored strength and manpower to conduct sweeping mechanized operations. In the field, those same forces struggled with radio communications that broke down under pressure, junior officers who lacked the initiative to exploit openings, and supply systems that could not yet sustain the tempo that offensive doctrine demanded. One exchange from these exercises lingered in the institutional memory of the Soviet officer corps for years afterward. General Georgy Zhukov, commanding the notional German forces in a major tabletop exercise, drove deep into Soviet lines with a mechanized thrust that severed communications, encircled defending formations, and exposed the entire defensive structure to collapse, all before the notional Soviet defenders could mount a coherent response. The lesson was elementary and devastating. Speed, coordination, and the willingness to exploit confusion could overcome numerical disadvantage. Zhukov was promptly appointed Chief of the General Staff, a promotion that reflected how clearly Stalin grasped the implications of what had just been demonstrated. Konev watched this exchange and filed it carefully in the calculus he was building about modern warfare, about what the Red Army could do and what it could not yet do, and what it would need to survive. Stalin's relationship with military intelligence in this period was a study in selective hearing. Reports arrived with regularity from Soviet agents abroad and from diplomatic observers, each carrying fragments of German operational planning. Troop concentrations near the Soviet border were documented and reported. Logistical preparations, the accumulation of fuel, ammunition, and bridging equipment on the Polish frontier were catalogued with increasing urgency by intelligence officers who understood what they were seeing. Stalin, convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain remained undefeated, interpreted these accumulations as preparation for political pressure rather than military assault. His generals, including Konev, operated under this assumption even as private doubts gathered. To voice those doubts too loudly was to invite the attention of institutions that had consumed better men than most. For Konev personally, these years represented a period of accelerating professional maturity. He turned 46 in 1940, no longer young, but not yet old, a commander in the middle passage of his career, with enough experience to have shed illusions, but enough energy to build on what remained. His manner with subordinates had evolved from the raw assertiveness of his Civil War years toward something harder to define: exacting, demanding, occasionally brutal in criticism, but fundamentally interested in results rather than appearances. He wanted formations that could fight, not formations that could parade. He pushed training schedules that commanders of less driven disposition resented, and that his political superiors occasionally questioned. He accumulated the kind of institutional reputation that makes superiors uncomfortable in peacetime and invaluable in war. The reputation of a man who would tell you what he actually found rather than what you wished to hear. By the spring of 1941, Konev had been given command of the 19th Army, a formation being assembled in the interior of the country as part of the second strategic echelon that Soviet planners were quietly constructing as insurance against catastrophic losses in a border engagement. This assignment placed him at a significant level of operational command, a full army, with all the complexity that entailed, while simultaneously keeping him one tier removed from the immediate crisis unfolding on the frontier. He used the months of preparation intensively. The 19th Army trained through the spring, conducting exercises that pushed units through river crossings, night movements, and communications drills. Konev was not satisfied with what these exercises revealed, but satisfaction was not the point. The point was to identify weakness before the enemy identified it for him. The wider military establishment underwent structural changes during this period that reflected both reform ambition and deepening anxiety. Mechanized corps were reconstituted after having been dissolved following Spanish Civil War debates, a policy reversal that acknowledged, belatedly, the devastating effectiveness of German armored concentration in France. New tank types, genuinely capable of matching German armor, were entering production in factories east of the Urals. Artillery formations were being reorganized and strengthened. The General Staff worked through scenarios that required coordinating multiple fronts across a theater stretching thousands of kilometers. Whether all of this would be enough, and whether enough of it could be assembled in time, remained the central, unspoken question that hovered over every planning session, every exercise, every quiet conversation between officers who trusted each other enough to speak honestly. What made Konev's trajectory in these years particularly significant was not any single command decision or any moment of dramatic recognition, but rather the cumulative pattern of assignments and responses that marked him as a commander capable of functioning under pressure that had broken others. He had survived the purges without either becoming an executioner or becoming a victim. He had absorbed the humiliation of the Finnish campaign without deflecting its lessons onto convenient scapegoats. He had served in distant, unglamorous postings with the same attention he would have given to commands in the European theatre. These qualities, resilience, intellectual honesty, professional tenacity, were not glamorous. They did not make for the stirring biographical narratives that revolutionary mythology preferred, but they were precisely the qualities that would matter when the carefully prepared defenses of the Soviet state met the full weight of what Germany was preparing to deliver. The summer of 1941 approached with the slow inevitability of a season that does not know it is dreaded. Reports from the frontier continued to arrive in Moscow. The German build-up was now impossible to misread, even for those most committed to misreading it. On the Soviet side of the border, units were at varying stages of readiness, dispersed across positions that reflected political assumptions more than military logic. Konev, moving his 19th Army toward its designated wartime positions in the western military districts, could feel the quality of the silence changing around him, thickening, darkening, acquiring the specific texture of the hours before something breaks. He was a general of the Soviet Union now, formed by its contradictions, hardened by its cruelties, tutored by its disasters. Whether that formation had produced something adequate to what was coming remained the question that every passing day made more urgent, and to which only the war itself would give its merciless answer. Before the sun had fully risen over the western frontier of the Soviet Union, the ground itself began to shake. It was the 22nd of June, 1941, a Sunday morning, and across a front stretching from the Baltic coast down to the Carpathian foothills, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory simultaneously. Artillery opened fire before dawn. Bombers swept low over Soviet airfields before most pilots had reached their cockpits. Within the first hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed where they sat, lined up in neat rows as if arranged for inspection rather than war. It was the largest single military operation in human history, and the Soviet Union, for all of Stalin's private fears and public denials, was caught in a state of catastrophic unreadiness. The border guards who died first had no time to understand what was happening to them. The war had not arrived with warnings. It had arrived like a wall of iron. Ivan Konev received his orders against the backdrop of chaos that morning. He was 47 years old, commanding the 19th Army, a substantial formation still completing its movement from the interior of Russia toward the Western Military District. His forces were not fully in position. The army was strung out across rail lines and staging areas, units arriving piecemeal, logistics unresolved, communications fragmented. This was the nature of Soviet military deployment in the summer of 1941, not a prepared fighting force ready to receive an attack, but a vast organism still in the process of assembling itself. The German blows fell across the frontier before that assembly could complete. For Konev and thousands of officers like him, the war began not with clarity, but with a cascade of contradictory reports, severed telephone lines, and the distant sound of artillery growing closer by the hour. What made the German assault so devastating in those first days was not merely its size, but its precision. Wehrmacht planners had studied Soviet dispositions with painstaking care, and they struck at the joints of the Soviet military structure, the headquarters, the communication nodes, the supply depots. Red Army commanders across the front lost contact with their superiors, with their subordinates, and in many cases with reality itself. False reports flooded upward. Accurate reports were disbelieved. Soviet generals who had survived Stalin's purges by telling their superiors what those superiors wished to hear were now trapped by that habit at the worst possible moment. The entire command culture of the Red Army, twisted out of shape by years of ideological terror, buckled under the first real test of modern war. Men who should have given orders sat waiting for permission that would never come. Formations dissolved. Entire armies ceased to exist as coherent fighting units within days. Konev was made of different material. Those who served with him later recalled that he possessed a particular quality that is rarer than courage, the capacity to function cognitively under conditions designed to induce paralysis. Where other commanders lost themselves in the scale of the disaster, Konev focused downward, on what he could control, his own formations, his own communications, his own axis of withdrawal. He was not immune to the shock. No one who witnessed the skies filled with German aircraft in those first days, no one who heard the reports of entire divisions swallowed whole on the frontier, could remain untouched. But Konev had spent the previous years studying German operational methods, watching the Wehrmacht's campaigns in Poland and France with the disciplined attention of a man who knew he would one day face the same machine. When that machine arrived, he recognized it. The Western Military District bore the worst of the initial German assault. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, drove east with terrifying speed, its armored spearheads reaching dozens of kilometers behind Soviet lines before Soviet commanders had even confirmed the attack was not a localized provocation. The encirclements that followed were enormous. Soviet forces caught between converging German pincers in a series of catastrophic pockets. Hundreds of thousands of men were surrounded, cut off, and systematically destroyed or captured within weeks. The cities of Minsk and Smolensk, the ancient heart of Western Russia, lay open before the German advance. The scale of collapse was so vast that it strained comprehension even for those living through it. Stalin himself retreated into seclusion for several days, apparently unable to process the magnitude of what had happened to the state he had built. Konev's 19th Army was committed to battle in the grinding defensive fighting along the approaches to Smolensk. The city itself had enormous symbolic and strategic weight. It stood on the road to Moscow, and its loss would place the German army within striking distance of the Soviet capital. Konev fought to slow the German advance, organizing defensive lines and counterattacks under conditions of extreme pressure. His formations were under strength, inadequately supplied, and facing an enemy that had mastered the tempo of armored warfare over 2 years of European campaigning. The Germans moved fast and struck at command nodes. Konev moved his headquarters repeatedly, understanding that to remain stationary was to invite destruction from above or encirclement from the flanks. He kept his army alive and fighting when others around him simply ceased to exist. What Konev could not do, what no Soviet commander could do in those weeks, was stop the German advance. Smolensk fell, and the fighting around it consumed Soviet formations at a rate that defied accounting. The battles there lasted weeks, a churning, attritional struggle in which Soviet forces attacked, were repulsed, were encircled, broke out, and attacked again. It was not victory. It was not even a strategic delay in the truest sense. But it was resistance, and resistance at this stage meant something profound. Every day the German advance was slowed was a day the Soviet state remained functional, a day more factories could be dismantled and shipped east, a day more reserves could be raised and trained. Konev understood this arithmetic even when the emotional weight of command threatened to obscure it. His job was not to win. His job was to not collapse. The psychological burden on Soviet commanders during these weeks is difficult to overstate. Above them sat Stalin, erratic with fury and fear, capable of ordering executions for military failures that were in truth the product of years of institutional dysfunction he himself had created. Commanders who retreated too far without permission faced arrest. Commanders who reported defeats too honestly faced accusations of defeatism. The system demanded success and punished honesty about failure, which meant that accurate information rarely reached the top, and that decisions made at the highest levels were based on distorted pictures of reality. Konev navigated this environment with the careful discipline he had refined during the purge years, truthful enough to maintain operational coherence, cautious enough to avoid the fate of colleagues who had been honest at the wrong moment. It was an exhausting and morally corrosive balance, but it was the condition of Soviet command in the summer of 1941. Among the things Konev observed and catalogued during those desperate weeks was the German method of armored exploitation. The Wehrmacht did not simply punch holes and stop. Its armored formations drove through breakthroughs at speed, bypassing centers of resistance, striking far into the depth of Soviet positions to seize bridges, crossroads, and communication hubs before Soviet reserves could respond. This was blitzkrieg operating at its most refined, and it had a psychological dimension that was as important as its physical one. It made Soviet defenders feel perpetually surrounded, perpetually behind, perpetually reacting to events rather than shaping them. Konev studied this. He studied how the Germans communicated between armored and air elements, how they maintained momentum even when their supply lines stretched thin, how they coordinated multiple axes of advance without losing coherence. It was an education conducted under fire, at cost in blood, but it was an education that would prove invaluable. There was, in those weeks, a personal dimension to Konev's position that cannot be entirely separated from the military one. He was a survivor of the purges, a man who had watched the Soviet officer corps hollowed out by execution and imprisonment. Many of the officers whose absence was now being most painfully felt, the experienced, senior commanders who had been shot or exiled in the 1930s, were men Konev had known. Their ghosts were present in every command decision that went wrong, because no one with sufficient experience remained to make it correctly. He had outlived them not by betraying them, but by surviving through caution and controlled ambition. And now he carried the weight of that survival into a war they had not lived to see. He fought, in some sense, for the Red Army that should have existed, the one that had not been bled dry by its own leadership before the first German shell fell. By late summer of 1941, the front had stabilized somewhat west of Moscow, though at enormous cost. Konev's formations had endured weeks of the most punishing combat imaginable, fighting withdrawal after fighting withdrawal, absorbing losses that would have destroyed less resilient organizations. The 19th Army emerged from those weeks, diminished in strength but unbroken in structure. It still functioned as a coherent military unit, which was not something that could be said of every Soviet formation that had begun the campaign. Konev had kept his headquarters functioning, maintained some degree of lateral communication with neighboring formations, and imposed enough order on retreat to prevent it from becoming rout. These were modest achievements measured against the catastrophe unfolding around him, but in the context of the summer of 1941, they marked him as a commander of uncommon quality. The losses of those first weeks would haunt the Soviet Union for years. The numbers stagger the mind even decades removed from the events. Millions of soldiers killed, wounded or captured, vast territories surrendered, the industrial heartland of Western Russia burning. But in the wreckage of those weeks, something was also being built. A generation of Soviet commanders was being tested in conditions of genuine extremity, and those who survived the test, who learned rather than shattered, who adapted rather than froze, were becoming something the German planners had not factored into their calculations. They were becoming formidable. Konev stood among them, a man forged in the worst opening campaign in his nation's military history, carrying forward not bitterness or despair, but something harder and more useful. He carried understanding, and in the war that still lay ahead, understanding would prove to be the most decisive weapon of all. Throughout 1941, the Red Army does not merely retreat, it unravels. The scale of Soviet losses becomes almost incomprehensible to those who study it. More than 3 million men killed, captured, or missing within the first half-year alone. Entire armies vanish into German encirclements. Tank formations that had seemed formidable on paper dissolve into scattered, burning hulks across the western steppe. The Wehrmacht's operational art, refined through 2 years of European conquest, meets a Soviet military machine still in the process of modernization, still burdened by doctrinal confusion, still reeling from the decimation of its officer corps by Stalin's purges. Into this catastrophe steps Ivan Konev, commanding the 19th Army in the Western Military District. He is no longer a junior officer learning the basics of command. He is a senior operational commander, responsible for hundreds of thousands of men, and he faces the full weight of German combined arms warfare, with almost no margin for error. The initial weeks after the invasion reveal the depth of Soviet vulnerability. Konev's forces encounter German panzer formations operating with a coordination and speed that Soviet commanders have never before encountered. The German army moves with precision, executing encirclement maneuvers with a ruthlessness born of previous campaigns in Poland and France. Soviet doctrine, based largely on static defense and forward concentration, offers few answers. Units receive contradictory orders from higher headquarters. Communication systems fail under the strain of rapid operations. Ammunition and fuel run short as supply lines stretch and break. Konev watches his formations being pushed backward in successive waves, their organized withdrawal gradually becoming something closer to flight. Yet even as disaster unfolds, Konev begins to observe, to calculate, to extract lessons from defeat. He notes the German preference for rapid advances along roads and rail lines. He observes how German commanders coordinate air support with ground operations, how the Luftwaffe's fighters and bombers work in tandem with panzer spearheads to crush Soviet resistance. He watches how German units maintain cohesion even when isolated, how they rely on initiative from junior officers rather than rigid adherence to orders from above. The encirclement threat becomes immediate and visceral. Like many senior Soviet commanders in 1941, Konev finds his own command structure suddenly surrounded, cut off from retreat routes, facing the prospect of capture or complete annihilation. He is in the field, not in some distant headquarters. He can see German forces closing around his formations. He can hear the artillery of encircling German units. He can feel the panic beginning to spread through his staff and subordinate commanders. This is not the theoretical understanding of military defeat. This is the raw, physical terror of a fighting soldier who knows the Germans do not take Soviet prisoners gently, who understands that capture means death, and whose responsibility extends to hundreds of thousands of men who will die if he loses control. Those who served under him in these desperate weeks record that he maintained composure even when surrounded, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He focuses on the practical problem of maintaining unit cohesion, of establishing corridors through German lines, of preserving enough force to continue fighting rather than surrendering in place. The mechanics of escape from encirclement become a masterclass in operational thinking under extreme stress. Konev must coordinate the withdrawal of multiple armies, manage the movement of artillery and mechanized units over limited roads, protect the retreat against German attack, and maintain the fighting capacity of those units that remain. He cannot move in daylight without inviting air attack. The roads become choked with refugees and military traffic. German reconnaissance elements probe constantly for opportunities to cut off Soviet columns. Yet Konev makes the decisions that allow his forces to break out. He abandons equipment when necessary. He leaves rearguard units to slow German pursuit, knowing that most will not survive. He prioritizes the preservation of unit officers and experienced non-commissioned officers, recognizing that these men are irreplaceable and that the survival of the force depends on retaining the framework that holds it together. When he finally breaks free from immediate encirclement, he has lost vast numbers of men, lost equipment that the Soviet Union can ill afford to lose, but has preserved a functioning military formation rather than seeing it destroyed completely. The pattern repeats throughout 1941. Konev commands formations in several different sectors of the front as the German advance pushes relentlessly eastward. Each sector brings new forms of tactical defeat. Each brings new opportunities to observe and to learn. He fights near Smolensk, in the central zone of the advance, where German forces move with mechanical efficiency. He commands in areas where the terrain offers both advantages and disadvantages, forests and rivers that should favor defense, but which German commanders navigate with precision and coordination. He watches as German units employing relatively small numbers of men overcome much larger Soviet formations through superior tactics, better training, and genuine mastery of mobile warfare. He sees Soviet commanders attempting to apply static defensive doctrine to a fluid, rapidly changing situation. He observes the catastrophic consequences when Soviet forces attempt frontal assaults against well-prepared German positions without adequate fire support. Each disaster becomes a data point in Konev's growing analysis of how modern warfare actually functions. The psychological dimension of repeated defeat cannot be minimized. 1941 is a year when Soviet officers disappear not only through enemy action, but through their own system's punishments for failure. Stalin's commissariat system demands accountability for losses. Defeated commanders face interrogation about why they lost, whether they showed cowardice, whether they harbored counter-revolutionary sentiments. Many do not survive these interrogations. Konev sees this happening around him. He sees commanders being called to Moscow after failures, disappearing into the system and never being heard from again. The pressure is extraordinary. Failure brings not only military consequences, but existential personal danger. Yet Konev appears to have approached this pressure differently than many of his contemporaries. Rather than becoming paralyzed by fear of Stalin's retribution, rather than attempting to hide failures or shift blame onto subordinates, Konev seems to have focused his energy on understanding why the failures occurred and how similar failures might be prevented in future. This approach is not only more honorable than the alternatives, but it is also more practical. Zhukov, Stalin's master strategist, appears to recognize in Konev someone who learns rather than merely survives, someone who extracts value from defeat. The systematic analysis of German tactics becomes Konev's invisible project throughout 1941. He does not have access to captured German training manuals or detailed intelligence reports that explain the philosophy behind Wehrmacht operations. He cannot consult with German military thinkers or study their doctrine in any formal sense. Instead, he learns through the most direct method possible. He faces German tactical formations repeatedly and studies what they do. He notes the German preference for combined arms operations, the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power into coordinated wholes. He observes that German commanders move with their advancing units rather than remaining in fixed headquarters, that they are present at critical moments to make decisions based on real-time information. He recognizes that the German army tolerates a degree of initiative from subordinate commanders, that the Soviet system, with its tradition of rigid obedience to orders, has never permitted. He notices that German units regroup quickly after setbacks, that they maintain discipline even in retreat, that they do not dissolve into panic when surrounded as Soviet units sometimes do. These are not theoretical insights. They come from facing German forces repeatedly, from studying the patterns of German attacks, from conversations with survivors of German encirclements, from interviews with prisoners who understand German operational methods. The encirclement failures teach Konev lessons about the importance of logistical preparation and territorial control that will inform all his subsequent operations. He learns that the vast distances across which the German army has advanced, distances of hundreds of kilometers, create vulnerabilities in supply lines. He recognizes that the Luftwaffe cannot protect all of these supply lines simultaneously. He understands that Soviet forces, if properly concentrated and coordinated, might inflict damage on German formations in the process of achieving these rapid advances. He observes that the German strategy of driving deep into Soviet territory, creating massive encirclements, and destroying Soviet armies depends on the Wehrmacht's ability to move faster than Soviet forces can react. If Soviet commanders could anticipate German movements, if they could establish defensive positions before German forces arrived, if they could coordinate large-scale counterattacks rather than merely reacting to German initiatives, the outcome might be different. These insights do not change 1941. The Red Army continues to retreat, continues to lose men and territory, continues to suffer enormous casualties. But Konev is slowly developing a framework for thinking about how to fight the Wehrmacht, rather than merely how to react to it. The winter of 1941 brings a partial respite, though not relief. The German advance slows as temperatures plummet and roads become impassable mud or frozen ruts. Konev's forces are positioned in the southern zone of the front as German forces attempt to drive toward Moscow. He experiences winter conditions as both horror and opportunity. The cold kills men and horses, freezes engines, makes movement difficult for both sides. But the cold also slows the German advance that has been devastating Soviet formations. It gives the Soviet system time to mobilize reserves, to reorganize defeated formations, to begin thinking about operations rather than merely survival. Konev participates in the first tentative Soviet counteroffensives, coordinating with other commanders under the overall direction of Zhukov. These operations do not achieve dramatic results. They do not push the Germans back decisively, but they prove something crucial. The Red Army can fight back. Soviet forces can inflict casualties on the Wehrmacht. German formations can be forced to retreat. This realization, emerging from 1941's catastrophic defeats, becomes the psychological foundation for everything that follows. By the end of 1941, Konev has been forged by disaster into something new. He is no longer a commander of the old Soviet school, trained in static defense and rigid adherence to orders from above. He has experienced mobile warfare at its most devastating. He has learned German tactics through repeated exposure to them. He has survived encirclements that destroyed other commanders. He has maintained the loyalty of subordinates even through defeats that might have shattered unit cohesion. Most importantly, he has refused to allow defeat to paralyze his thinking. While other commanders have been destroyed, either by the Germans through death in combat or by Stalin through execution for failure, Konev has transformed disaster into understanding. He has systematized his observations. He has developed hypotheses about how the Red Army might better employ its vastly superior manpower and resources against a German army that, for all its tactical superiority, cannot sustain indefinite campaigns across infinite territory. The lessons of 1941 will inform every operation Konev conducts for the remainder of the war. The cost of this education has been almost unimaginable. Millions of Soviet soldiers have died so that Konev and other commanders could learn through experience what they could not learn from doctrine or training. Entire armies have been destroyed. Vast territories have been lost. Families across the Soviet Union have received notification that their husbands, sons, and fathers will not be returning. Yet from this human catastrophe emerges a Soviet military that is beginning to understand how to fight the Wehrmacht on equal terms. Konev emerges as one of the architects of this transformation. He does not receive recognition for this role. His name is not prominent in the Soviet press. His victories are not yet celebrated, but Zhukov notices him. Stalin's master strategist recognizes in Konev someone who learns from disaster, who thinks operationally rather than tactically, who can coordinate large formations and complex maneuvers. This recognition will change the trajectory of Konev's war, moving him from a commander fighting desperate delaying actions to a commander who will spearhead Soviet advances across Eastern Europe. The transition from defensive desperation to strategic offensive will not happen overnight, and the road ahead remains extraordinarily difficult. But the foundation has been laid during 1941. Konev has learned what it means to face a superior opponent and survive. He has discovered his own capacity to think clearly under pressure. He has developed a sophisticated understanding of German military method. He has begun to envision how the vast Soviet state, with its enormous resources and endless manpower, might eventually overwhelm an invading force, no matter how technically superior that force might be. The disasters of 1941, terrible as they are, contain within them the seeds of Soviet victory. And even Konev, through calm observation and relentless learning, has positioned himself to be one of the instruments through which that victory is achieved. The autumn of 1941 had brought catastrophe to the Soviet Union at a scale almost beyond comprehension. In the 4 months following Operation Barbarossa's launch on the 22nd of June, German armies had driven deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, capturing millions of prisoners, and advancing toward Moscow itself. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, its coordination and firepower overwhelming Soviet defenses again and again. By October, German spearheads stood within 100 kilometers of the Soviet capital, and the political and military leadership in Moscow faced the gravest crisis in the state's history. Factories were being evacuated eastward, government offices prepared contingency plans for withdrawal, and the mood among Soviet commanders ranged from grim determination to near despair. Yet in this moment of maximum vulnerability, Ivan Konev found himself positioned to participate in an operation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war and prove for the first time that the Wehrmacht could be stopped and even forced to retreat. Konev's assignment in November 1941 placed him on the Moscow front, commanding forces in the Western Military District under the broader strategic direction of General Georgy Zhukov, the officer whom Stalin trusted above all others to orchestrate Soviet military operations. Zhukov, a brilliant and ruthlessly pragmatic commander, had arrived at the Moscow sector in early autumn to stabilize the front and prepare for the Soviet counteroffensive that both he and Stalin believed must come once German momentum was exhausted. Zhukov worked from a deceptively simple premise. The German advance had extended supply lines to the breaking point. Winter conditions were approaching that would favor Soviet forces, and German reserves had been consumed through months of continuous combat. Where most Soviet commanders saw only disaster, Zhukov identified opportunity. He began concentrating Soviet reserves behind the Moscow defenses, building multiple defensive belts and preparing formations for a sudden violent counterattack, designed not merely to defend Moscow, but to exploit German weakness and drive the Wehrmacht backward. Konev, despite his relative youth, compared to some of his peers and his recent military setbacks, had earned Zhukov's confidence through his capacity to absorb punishment without losing his grip on tactical reality. The German assault on Moscow reached its climax in early December 1941, but it had already lost its force. German divisions attacking the Soviet positions were exhausted, under strength, and increasingly hampered by the onset of deep winter. The Wehrmacht had not prepared for prolonged winter warfare. German soldiers lacked proper cold weather clothing, and vehicles and equipment froze in temperatures that dropped far below anything the German army had anticipated. Soviet forces, by contrast, had trained in these conditions since their military service began and had reserve formations arriving from Siberia, hardened troops specifically acclimated to winter fighting. On the 6th of December, German forces mounted their final major assault on Soviet positions defending Moscow, and when that assault failed to achieve a breakthrough, the initiative began to pass to the Soviets. Zhukov immediately ordered the execution of Operation Kutuzov, named after the Russian general who had defeated Napoleon a century and a third earlier, a counter-offensive designed to drive German forces away from Moscow and exploit their tactical exhaustion. Konev, commanding the 19th Army, was positioned to spearhead one of the main Soviet thrusts, driving into the German flank and attempting to encircle exposed enemy formations. What emerged over the following weeks was unprecedented in the Soviet war experience so far. A Soviet offensive that actually worked, that achieved its objectives, and that inflicted serious defeats on German forces. The psychological significance of this achievement cannot be overstated. For 5 months, Soviet soldiers had experienced only retreat, encirclement, and catastrophic casualties. German propaganda had relentlessly portrayed the Wehrmacht as invincible, and many Soviet troops had begun to believe it, despite their ideological training. Now, in the snow-covered landscape around Moscow, Soviet soldiers advanced against German positions, watching German soldiers retreat before them, capturing intact weapons and equipment, and for the first time emerging victorious from a large-scale engagement. Konev's own role in this offensive, though often overshadowed in accounts that emphasize Zhukov's orchestration, involved the concrete business of coordinating multiple divisions across winter terrain, managing supply lines stretched across frozen ground, and maintaining momentum through conditions that threatened to immobilize armies. He learned in practice how to sustain an advance when temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below freezing, when vehicles would not start without being heated for hours, and when the simple act of moving supplies from rear areas to frontline units became a battle unto itself. The Moscow counter-offensive revealed the enormous gap between Soviet strategic ambition and operational capacity. Zhukov had conceived a grand plan to drive German forces far from Moscow and inflict a decisive defeat that might even threaten Hitler's entire Eastern Front strategy. Yet in execution, the reality proved far more modest. Soviet divisions, though they advanced successfully, did not drive with the speed or coordination necessary to encircle large German formations. German forces, despite their exhaustion, maintained sufficient tactical discipline to conduct fighting withdrawals and avoid the catastrophic encirclements that Zhukov had envisioned. Supply lines, stretched across frozen terrain and across a landscape devastated by previous fighting, could not sustain rapid advances. Trucks broke down in the extreme cold, supply depots became unreachable, and frontline units often found themselves without fuel, ammunition, or food, despite the best efforts of Soviet logisticians. Konev, commanding at the operational level where strategy meets reality, had to navigate this gap between ambition and capacity continually. He pushed his forces forward as aggressively as circumstances permitted, but also learned when to pause to rebuild supply lines, consolidate positions, and prepare for the next bound forward, rather than persist in marginal advances that consumed resources without achieving strategic effect. Working under Zhukov's direction proved transformative for Konev's understanding of how large-scale Soviet operations actually functioned. Zhukov, despite his reputation as a ruthless master of coercion, operated with a sophistication that combined violence with strategic calculation and an almost engineering-like precision in moving large forces across a battlefield. He communicated through a network of representatives stationed with different army commands, ensuring that Stalin's intentions were understood and executed, but also creating channels through which practical concerns could be communicated back to Moscow. Zhukov understood the importance of logistics to a degree unusual among Soviet commanders of that era. He would interrogate staff officers about ammunition reserves, fuel stocks, and transport capacity with the same intensity he applied to tactical matters. Konev absorbed these lessons through proximity and observation, understanding that victory in modern warfare required not merely the willingness to accept casualties and press forward, but rather a systematic approach to marshalling resources, coordinating movements, and maintaining communication across scattered formations spread across vast distances. The winter conditions themselves imposed lessons that would shape Soviet warfare for the remainder of the conflict. Soviet forces, adapted to winter through centuries of experience, discovered that German forces could not sustain operations in the same conditions that Soviet soldiers could endure. However, this advantage was not absolute. Soviet soldiers still suffered tremendously from the cold, frostbite, and cold-related illnesses caused casualties almost as serious as enemy fire in some sectors. Supply lines to frontline positions, stretched across frozen terrain, often failed to deliver the food, fuel, and winter clothing that troops required. The Red Army's vehicles, though somewhat better adapted to cold than German equivalents, still broke down frequently, and the maintenance required to keep engines running consumed enormous quantities of fuel and lubricants. Konev's commanders reported constantly on these challenges, and Konev had to make brutal decisions about where to commit reserves, which advances to press, and which sectors to stabilize and hold rather than push forward. Winter, the traditional ally of Russian defense, had become an ally of Soviet counteroffense as well, but only because the Soviet system and Soviet soldiers had learned to function within its constraints, in ways that the German army could not match. The political dimensions of the Moscow counteroffensive operated beneath the surface of military operations, but shaped Konev's behavior in subtle ways. Stalin's presence at military headquarters, his demand for constant updates, and his capacity for explosive anger at perceived failures or insufficiency created a psychological atmosphere in which commanders operated with awareness that mistakes could have consequences far beyond simple military reversal. Zhukov had developed techniques for managing this relationship, combining meticulous documentation of operations with calculated pessimism in reporting that left room for overachievement. Konev, observing Zhukov's interactions with Stalin through representatives and communications that circulated through the command structure, began to understand how to operate effectively in this environment. Success on the battlefield mattered, but so did the appearance of competence, the ability to explain setbacks as learning experiences rather than failures, and the capacity to execute orders while also providing the information that senior leadership required. The Moscow counteroffensive taught Konev lessons in military politics that would serve him throughout the war and into the post-war years. By late January 1942, the Moscow counteroffensive had achieved its fundamental objective. German forces had been driven away from the Soviet capital, the immediate threat to Moscow's survival had ended, and the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The tactical results of the operation, however, were more modest than Soviet leaders had initially hoped. German forces had not been decisively defeated or encircled. Instead, they had conducted a fighting withdrawal to positions some distance west of Moscow. Soviet casualties in the counteroffensive, though fewer than Soviet losses in earlier periods, had still been substantial, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, and Soviet forces had suffered their own encirclements and tactical reverses during the operation. The territory gained, while important psychologically, was measured in tens of kilometers rather than the hundreds that might have represented a truly decisive breakthrough. Yet these limitations should not obscure the genuine significance of what had been accomplished. The Soviet Union had demonstrated that it could seize the initiative militarily, that its armies could inflict serious losses on German forces and drive them backward, and that the Wehrmacht, despite its overwhelming victories so far, was not unbeatable. This knowledge, transmitted through the Soviet command structure and broadcast to the public through Soviet media and radio, fundamentally altered the psychological balance between the combatants. For Konev personally, the Moscow counteroffensive represented a crucial transformation in his development as a commander. He had now participated in offensive operations under the direction of the Soviet Union's most skilled strategist, had managed large formations in the most challenging weather conditions imaginable, had confronted the gap between strategic ambition and operational capacity, and had learned how to navigate the political dimensions of command within the Soviet system. He had also proven himself capable of executing Zhukov's vision without losing his own operational grip, and of adapting Soviet forces to conditions that the German army could not match. Yet the lesson Konev carried forward from Moscow was not triumphalism, but rather a sophisticated understanding of Soviet military capacity and its limitations. The Red Army could defeat the Wehrmacht, but only through methodical preparation, ruthless execution, learning from experience, and the systematic application of force across time. Soviet victory would not come from a sudden brilliant stroke, but from grinding campaigns fought through mud and snow, through exhaustion and sacrifice, through the patient accumulation of advantage. This understanding would shape Konev's approach to every major operation he would command in the years ahead. By 1942, the Soviet Union had endured more than 8 months of catastrophic retreat. The Wehrmacht had penetrated deeper into Russian territory than any invading force in centuries. Yet the Red Army, despite staggering losses, refused to collapse entirely. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, Soviet counterattacks near Moscow had bloodied the German advance and proved that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. But this fragile momentum would soon encounter a more brutal teacher. A small city in western Russia named Rzhev would become the grinding stone upon which both Soviet ambition and German resilience would be tested to their absolute limits. Konev, having survived the chaos of 1941 and earned recognition for his work in the Moscow counteroffensive, now stood at the threshold of a campaign that would expose the raw cost of large-scale warfare and force him to confront truths about his own strategic thinking that no classroom instruction could have prepared him to accept. The roads to Rzhev were frozen mud and human suffering. In 1942, the city occupied a crucial position on the German-Soviet front, lying roughly 160 kilometers west of Moscow and serving as a vital junction point in German logistics. For the Soviets, Rzhev represented an obsession, a place where German forces had dug in, a salient that protruded into Soviet-held territory like a thorn, and a symbol of German occupation that demanded removal. Konev took command of forces tasked with eliminating this salient, coordinating multiple armies in what would become a months-long attritional struggle. The terrain around Rzhev offered no advantage to the attacker. Forests gave way to open ground broken by ravines and river valleys, all of it torn and cratered from previous fighting. The ground was frozen solid in winter, which meant that digging proper entrenchments became nearly impossible. The thaw of spring transformed the landscape into a swamp, where vehicles sank and supply lines became nightmares of logistical futility. Konev inherited a battle that was already 3 months old when he took command, a grinding engagement where neither side had achieved decisive results, only accumulated casualties. The first phase of Konev's campaign, beginning in late 1942, exemplified a fundamental problem in Soviet operational planning: the assumption that sufficient commitment of men and material could break through any enemy position. Soviet commanders, operating under Stalin's impatient gaze and constrained by ideological emphasis on revolutionary will overcoming material obstacles, often committed their forces to frontal assaults that yielded marginal territorial gains at catastrophic human cost. Konev ordered repeated attacks against prepared German positions held by forces under the command of German General Walter Model, one of the Wehrmacht's most accomplished defensive tacticians. Model understood that Soviet attacks typically followed predictable patterns: massed infantry assaults preceded by artillery bombardment, followed by mechanized exploitation if breakthrough occurred. He arranged his defenses in depth, creating multiple defensive belts where attacking Soviet forces would exhaust themselves breaking through one position, only to encounter another equally strong defensive line beyond it. Konev's attacks broke against these defenses like waves against stone cliffs. In some sectors, Soviet forces advanced no more than a few kilometers over the course of weeks, yet the casualty rolls continued to mount with relentless consistency. The human cost became the defining characteristic of the Rzhev campaign. Soviet and German sources suggest that between 1942 and 1943, the battles around Rzhev consumed more than 1 million casualties combined. The Red Army, despite vast manpower reserves, suffered losses that would have destroyed armies in the Western War. Entire divisions were shattered, reformed, and shattered again. Frontline soldiers endured conditions of medieval hardship: frozen feet that led to gangrene and amputation, hunger that drove men to desperation, and the psychological terror of futile attacks against well-fortified positions. Medical services were overwhelmed. Evacuation of wounded occurred in conditions of such chaos that mortality from untreated injuries matched combat deaths. Konev, observing this carnage from his headquarters, could not claim ignorance of the human cost. Reports reached him daily, detailing unit strengths, casualty figures, and the diminishing capacity of exhausted formations to execute offensive operations. Yet the orders to continue came from above, from Zhukov and Stalin, who saw the Rzhev salient as a canker that must be excised regardless of the bleeding required. What distinguished this period in Konev's development was not success, but rather his gradual recognition of failure's lessons. Unlike commanders who rationalized defeat through claims of inadequate resources or the inherent superiority of German forces, Konev began a systematic analysis of why frontal assault, no matter how powerfully executed, could not break Model's defenses. He observed that German forces, though numerically inferior, maintained better discipline through withdrawal and counterattack. He noted that German field engineers rapidly reconstructed damaged positions, while Soviet logistical planning failed to keep pace with the supply demands of sustained offensive operations. He recognized that Soviet doctrine, shaped by years of Civil War experiences and ideological emphasis on offensive revolutionary energy, had not adapted to the complex requirements of breaking through sophisticated defensive systems. This recognition did not come as a sudden revelation, but rather accumulated through months of bitter experience. Konev began consulting with his staff officers about alternative approaches, studying maps and reports in search of weaknesses in German positioning that might be exploited through maneuver rather than frontal collision. By the spring of 1943, the campaign around Rzhev entered a new phase that would prove decisive in transforming Konev's understanding of operational warfare. Soviet planners conceived Operation Kutuzov, a pincer movement designed to encircle German forces in the Rzhev salient by striking both northern and southern flanks simultaneously. Rather than continuing the frontal battering that had failed repeatedly, this operation attempted to replicate successful encirclement tactics that had proven effective elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The operation required precise coordination between multiple armies, careful timing to prevent German escape, and sustained logistical support across terrain that remained largely impassable during the Rasputitsa, the mud season, when spring thaws turned roads into rivers of slime. Konev oversaw the southern arm of the encirclement, coordinating the movements of multiple armies across devastated terrain while maintaining contact with German forces and preventing them from breaking through the tightening noose. The operation succeeded partially. German forces, facing envelopment, chose to withdraw rather than risk catastrophic encirclement, abandoning Rzhev in early March 1943. The Soviet capture of Rzhev appeared as a victory on maps and in official communiques. Soviet forces occupied the city and thousands of square kilometers of territory previously held by German forces. Yet the price of this victory demanded confrontation with uncomfortable truths. The German withdrawal was executed in good order, extracting most of the Wehrmacht's forces from the salient, rather than surrendering them to encirclement. Soviet forces occupied rubble rather than conquered viable positions. The infrastructure of Rzhev, whatever it had been before 1942, was obliterated. The surrounding villages were empty, populated only by corpses and graves. More significantly, Soviet casualties, estimates ranging from 300,000 to nearly 1 million depending on which records are consulted, vastly exceeded German losses. Soviet forces had poured enormous resources into a campaign that achieved territorial gain without achieving any operational breakthrough or substantive weakening of German capacity to continue fighting. The strategic situation in 1943 remained largely unchanged from 1942, except that Soviet manpower had been bled down further. Konev's personal response to the Rzhev campaign reveals the maturing of his character as a commander. He did not attempt to minimize the losses through misleading reports or inflated enemy casualty figures, though such dishonesty was common among Soviet commanders. Rather, he accepted responsibility for decisions made and forced himself to extract lessons from failure. In communications with Zhukov and in discussions with his staff, Konev began articulating a different approach to Soviet operational planning. He argued that while the Red Army possessed advantages in manpower and material production, these advantages were finite. Casualties of the magnitude seen at Rzhev represented irreplaceable losses of trained personnel and equipment. Soviet forces could not sustain indefinite attritional warfare at such scales without eventually losing the capacity to mount large-scale offensive operations. Therefore, he reasoned, Soviet commanders must husband resources more carefully, must attempt to achieve breakthrough and exploitation through maneuver rather than attrition, and must coordinate operations to achieve concentration of force at decisive points rather than dispersing effort across broad fronts. The intellectual framework that Konev began constructing during the Rzhev campaign would find full expression in the subsequent battles of 1943. At Kursk, which unfolded later that summer, Konev would participate in planning defensive operations that prioritized sophisticated use of terrain, multiple defensive belts, and counterattack rather than frontal assault. The lessons learned in the frozen fields around Rzhev about the limits of direct attack against prepared positions would inform his approach to that larger battle. Konev emerged from Rzhev not as a shattered officer incapable of further command, as many might have been, but as a commander whose understanding of warfare had been fundamentally revised through brutal experience. The cost of this education was immeasurable in human suffering, but it produced a strategist whose subsequent operations would be marked by greater sophistication and a deeper appreciation for the relationship between logistics, terrain, timing, and manpower efficiency. The Rzhev campaign also elevated Konev's standing within the Soviet command hierarchy, though perhaps not in ways he anticipated. Stalin, despite the campaign's enormous cost, viewed the occupation of Rzhev as a success and validation of Soviet strategic will. Konev's willingness to commit forces to the campaign and his ultimate achievement of territorial gain earned him recognition as a commander capable of executing large-scale offensive operations. Simultaneously, his growing reputation brought him into closer orbit around Zhukov, the Soviet General Staff's preeminent figure. Zhukov recognized in Konev not merely a ruthless executioner of orders, but an officer capable of independent strategic thought and willing to engage in frank assessment of military realities. This combination of Stalin's favor and Zhukov's respect positioned Konev for higher responsibilities. The grinding brutality of Rzhev, therefore, served not as a cap on his career, but as a grim credential in a command structure where success was often measured less by elegance than by willingness to accept casualties and achieve objectives regardless of cost. The world of the Eastern Front in 1943 reflected the exhaustion of both belligerents, yet Konev's personal trajectory moved in the opposite direction. Where the world around him showed signs of wear and erosion, Konev seemed to gather strength from hard experience. The young officer who had joined the Red Army 3 decades earlier during the Russian Civil War had become a seasoned operator capable of thinking strategically about the orchestration of large formations. Rzhev had not been his victory in any conventional sense. Thousands of men under his command had died for marginal territorial gain. The city itself was devastated beyond recognition. Yet from this wreckage, Konev had learned lessons about the necessity of patience, the value of maneuver over direct assault, and the importance of logistical precision to operational success. These insights, born from months of failure and mounting casualties, would shape his approach to the final phase of the Soviet advance westward toward Germany itself. By the middle of 1943, the Eastern Front entered a new period characterized by more sophisticated Soviet operational planning. The Red Army had learned from repeated defeats and costly victories that raw commitment of manpower, while essential to war at such enormous scales, could not substitute for careful planning and operational precision. Konev's participation in the Rzhev campaign, despite its grim human cost, had contributed to this evolution. He stood now among the senior Soviet commanders not because he had discovered some revolutionary tactical insight or because his forces had achieved dramatic breakthroughs, but because he had endured months of grinding warfare, absorbed the lessons of failure, and emerged with his understanding of war fundamentally altered and strengthened. The Rzhev campaign, forgotten in the shroud of larger battles like Kursk and Berlin, had forged Konev into something more formidable than he had been when he arrived. He was no longer a promising officer learning his profession. He was a commander who understood warfare's relentless mathematics, the terrible cost of failure, and the necessity of thinking beyond the immediate moment toward the larger shape of strategy. These hard-won insights would carry him through the campaigns to come and would eventually establish him as one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished operational commanders. By the summer of 1943, the Soviet Union had begun to transform from a desperate victim of German invasion into something far more formidable, a military power capable of setting the terms of battle. The Red Army no longer simply reacted to German moves. Instead, Soviet commanders had learned to anticipate, to prepare, to build defenses so elaborate and so deep that the Wehrmacht's traditional tactics of breakthrough and encirclement would break against them like waves against stone. At the center of this transformation stood a place name that would become synonymous with the largest armored engagement in human history, Kursk. And standing among the architects of this epic confrontation was Ivan Konev, a commander whose entire career had been a progression from chaos toward mastery, from improvisation toward calculated design. In the spring of 1943, as intelligence reports confirmed that the Germans were preparing a massive offensive aimed at the Kursk salient, Konev moved into position not as an isolated tactician, but as part of an integrated command structure that represented the maturation of Soviet military thought. The Kursk salient itself was a geographical feature that invited German attention. The Soviet front lines bulged westward in a massive arc, forming a promontory surrounded on three sides by German-held territory. To any commander trained in conventional operational thinking, the salient represented opportunity. Pincer movements from north and south could encircle vast Soviet forces, potentially replicating the successes that German armies had achieved in the opening years of the war. German planners, particularly those in Army Group Center under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and Army Group South under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, had identified this weakness and developed a plan called Operation Citadel. The offensive would strike from both north and south, with the intention of crushing Soviet forces in a vast double envelopment. German commanders possessed superiority in armor and tactical doctrine. They had manufactured new tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, and new assault guns designed specifically to counter Soviet armored formations. Everything pointed toward a German victory that might restore initiative to the Wehrmacht after months of retreat. Everything, that is, except for one crucial variable: Soviet intelligence. Soviet military intelligence, guided by the formidable spy ring known as the Lucy Network, had acquired precise information about German intentions weeks in advance of the offensive. Konev, working alongside General Georgy Zhukov, the man who had emerged as Stalin's chief military strategist, received confirmation that Operation Citadel would commence in early July. This advance warning gave the Soviets an extraordinary advantage. Rather than allowing themselves to be caught in a reactive posture, Konev and other senior commanders could now plan defensively, constructing fortifications and positioning reserves with the precise knowledge of where and when German forces would attack. The implications of this intelligence coup were staggering. The Red Army would not defend against Kursk reactively. It would defend against Kursk actively. It would build defenses so formidable that German tactics, tested and refined across Eastern Europe, would lose their cutting edge against Soviet stone walls of concrete, mines, anti-tank guns, and disciplined infantry. Konev's role in this massive undertaking reflected his emergence as an operational thinker of genuine sophistication. He had moved beyond the desperate learning curve that had defined his early war experience. His assignments through 1942 and early 1943 had given him responsibility for large formations in defensive and counter-offensive operations. He understood Soviet logistical capabilities and limitations. He grasped the psychology of command, how to maintain discipline and morale across hundreds of thousands of troops facing a technologically formidable enemy. And he had absorbed, through hard experience and the mentorship of Zhukov, the fundamental principle that would govern Soviet operations at Kursk: victory through preparation, through elaboration of defensive systems so complex and deep that attrition would become the enemy's fate. When Zhukov and other senior commanders gathered to plan the Kursk defense, Konev contributed not merely compliance with directives from above, but operational analysis grounded in his own battle experience. His voice carried weight. His suggestions reflected tactical wisdom earned in years of fighting. The defensive preparations at Kursk became the most elaborate fortification scheme the Soviet Union had yet undertaken. Multiple defensive belts extended deep into Soviet territory, some stretching as far as 190 kilometers from the front line. The first defensive zone contained anti-tank guns positioned in depth, designed not to stop German armor but to attrite it, to force German tanks to advance through clouds of shells and mines, losing strength with each kilometer. Behind this lay second and third defensive zones, each constructed with similar principle. German forces would not break through these defenses cleanly. They would be ground down. Behind these defensive belts lay reserves, vast assemblies of Soviet armor and mechanized infantry, positioned to seal any breakthrough and to launch counter-offensives once German momentum had been exhausted. Konev's understanding of the operation encompassed both the tactical minutiae of this system and the strategic imperative behind it. The Soviets were not merely trying to prevent a German breakthrough, they were creating a mechanism by which German offensive power would be consumed and destroyed. The battle would become a furnace in which the Wehrmacht's strength would be consumed. When the Germans finally halted, they would be weaker. Soviet reserves, husbanded with care, would advance. The initiative that had seemed to slip away in 1942 would be seized permanently. The construction of these defenses required unprecedented coordination across the Soviet command structure. Hundreds of thousands of workers, both civilian and military, labored to dig trenches, emplacement positions, and anti-tank ditches. Vast quantities of mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, were manufactured and distributed. Artillery and anti-tank guns were positioned with surgical precision, each placement calculated to create interlocking fields of fire. Supply lines were extended to provide ammunition, fuel, and food for millions of troops. This administrative undertaking represented the transformation of the Red Army from an improvised force responding to crisis into a disciplined military machine capable of executing plans of extraordinary complexity. Konev oversaw elements of this preparation, translating strategic directives into operational orders that moved armies into position. He coordinated with neighboring commanders, ensuring that the defensive system functioned as an integrated whole rather than as isolated segments. His staff work had become far more sophisticated than in the chaotic early years of the war. The young officer who had survived the chaos of the Russian Civil War through luck and adaptability had evolved into an operational commander capable of managing enormous enterprises. As the German offensive finally commenced in early July, the Soviet defensive system absorbed the shock with far greater success than German planners had anticipated. German forces attacking from the north under Kluge achieved less progress than in previous operations. German forces attacking from the south under Manstein advanced further, but at enormous cost and against escalating Soviet resistance. The German tanks and assault guns that had been expected to sweep through the Kursk defenses encountered waves of anti-tank fire, minefields, and counterattacks that disrupted their momentum. What emerged over the course of weeks was not the sharp breakthrough that German operational doctrine had taught, the Kesselschlacht, the cauldron battle in which Soviet forces would be encircled and destroyed, but rather a prolonged attrition in which German strength was consumed against prepared defences. By mid-July, with German advances slowing and Soviet counteroffensives beginning to take shape, the fundamental outcome was becoming clear. The Kursk offensive would fail as a German strategic operation. The Soviets would hold the salient. More than this, they would launch counteroffensives of their own, seizing initiative permanently and beginning the final series of advances that would carry Soviet forces to Berlin. Konev's intellectual understanding of what was occurring at Kursk extended beyond the immediate tactical picture. He grasped the strategic implications of Soviet success. This battle marked a threshold. The Wehrmacht had attempted one more grand offensive operation in the east, hoping to restore the tempo of conquest and territorial gain that had characterized 1941 and 1942. The failure of this effort, the inability of German arms to break through well-prepared Soviet defenses, meant that the Wehrmacht's offensive capacity in the east had been exhausted. Henceforth, Soviet forces would advance and German forces would retreat. The machinery that had caused so much suffering to the Soviet Union, that had penetrated so deeply into Soviet territory, that had threatened to destroy the Soviet state, had reached the limit of its power. This was not a small thing. This represented a fundamental shift in the character of the war. Konev understood this. He had fought in enough battles to recognize when a historical turning point had been reached. Kursk would be the last great German offensive operation in the Soviet Union. After Kursk, the advance would be Soviet. The sophistication of Konev's thinking crystallized at Kursk in ways that would shape his remaining years of combat command. He had absorbed the principle that modern warfare at the highest level required meticulous preparation, elaborate logistical systems, and the integration of multiple operational echelons into a unified strategic design. The days of desperate improvisation, though never entirely absent from Soviet operations, had given way to calculated operational planning. Konev understood that speed and aggression, while still vital, had to be grounded in careful preparation and supported by supply lines, reserves, and communication systems that could function reliably across vast distances and extended periods of combat. The Red Army that emerged from Kursk was not merely numerically superior to the Wehrmacht. It was operationally more sophisticated. It could plan complex multi-front offensives, coordinate movements across hundreds of kilometers, and execute plans that integrated armor, mechanized infantry, and artillery in combinations that achieved strategic effects beyond the sum of individual tactical engagements. As the immediate crisis of the Kursk battle gave way to exploitation and pursuit, Konev transitioned toward even greater responsibilities. He had proven himself in defensive operations and in the coordination of large reserves. He had demonstrated an ability to work effectively with Zhukov and other senior commanders within Stalin's command structure. His standing had risen markedly. The provincial officer who had struggled through the early years of the war, learning desperately from each battle, had become one of the Soviet Union's most important operational commanders. At Kursk, his operational thinking achieved maturity. The uncertainty and improvisation that had characterized his early war years gave way to disciplined strategic vision. Kursk marked not merely a military victory, but a point of personal transformation for Konev himself. He had moved from the periphery of command toward its very center. The battles ahead, the drive through Ukraine, the advance toward Poland, and ultimately the assault on Berlin itself, would all be shaped by the lessons he had absorbed through years of desperate learning and the crystallization of that learning into a coherent strategic vision that had first manifested fully at Kursk. The larger significance of Kursk extended beyond Konev himself, or even the Soviet military command structure. For the German armed forces, Kursk represented the final exhaustion of a strategic vision that had sustained them through years of aggressive conquest. For the Soviet Union, it represented the emergence of a military establishment capable not merely of surviving the Nazi assault, but of defeating it through coordinated application of force, careful planning, and the transformation of available resources into operational effects. The tank battle itself, with hundreds of thousands of armored vehicles clashing across the steppes, would become legendary in military history as the largest engagement of its kind. But the true significance of Kursk lay not in the tanks, but in the minds that directed them. At Kursk, the Soviet command structure, including Ivan Konev, demonstrated that they had mastered the operational art at the level of hundreds of thousands of troops and vast territories. They could shape battlefields through defense and through counter-offensive. They could absorb German assaults and transform defensive success into strategic advance. At Kursk, the Red Army came of age as a modern military force fully capable of defeating the Wehrmacht. And Konev, who had fought and learned through the devastating years of 1941 and 1942, stood among the architects of this transformation. The Battle of Kursk ended not with the sweep of cavalry charges or the sudden collapse of enemy lines, but with a grinding realization that the German Wehrmacht could no longer sustain the offensive power that had defined the first half of the war. When Konev emerged from the planning sessions and defensive preparations that had consumed the summer of 1943, he stood at a threshold. The defensive victory at Kursk had proven that Soviet commanders could read German intentions, construct sophisticated defensive positions, and absorb massive assaults while maintaining their formations. Yet victory in defense, no matter how complete, was not the same as strategic victory. The Red Army had learned to stop the Germans. Now came the test that would define the remainder of the war. Could Soviet commanders learn to pursue them across the vastness of European Russia and beyond? In early September 1943, Stalin and his military leadership recognized that the initiative had shifted fundamentally. The defensive lines that had protected the Kursk salient were no longer needed as shields. They were now launching pads. Soviet planners began moving their gaze eastward and southward, examining the territories that German forces still occupied across Ukraine and southern Russia. The challenge before the Red Army was immense and multifaceted. Soviet forces would need to advance across hundreds of kilometers of devastated terrain, maintain supply lines that stretched across a landscape torn by 2 years of warfare, manage the movement of literally hundreds of thousands of troops, coordinate the actions of multiple armies operating in different sectors, and do all of this while the enemy, though weakened, still possessed formidable defensive capabilities and the advantage of shorter interior lines. This was not merely a military problem, it was an operational problem of staggering complexity, the kind that separated competent commanders from those capable of thinking at the scale of continental warfare. Konev's ascent to command of the steppe front represented Stalin's recognition that he had evolved beyond the category of a capable field commander. The steppe front was not a defensive formation meant to hold ground or support another general's operations. It was an instrument of Soviet strategic intention, a massive force designed to exploit breakthroughs, pursue broken enemy formations, and advance Soviet territorial control across entire regions. The force he commanded was almost impossible to comprehend from a purely numerical perspective. Under his authority were multiple armies, each containing hundreds of thousands of men. Supporting these armies were vast concentrations of artillery, mechanized brigades, engineers, logistical units, and supporting services. The front controlled more tanks and mechanized vehicles than many nations possessed in their entirety. To orchestrate this force, to move it across distance, to feed it, to arm it, to maintain its cohesion while it advanced into territory that had been scorched and rendered nearly uninhabitable by 2 years of warfare, required a type of thinking that went far beyond tactical competence. The Steppe Front's first major operation began in the late autumn of 1943, as Konev and his staff coordinated offensives designed to push German forces back across Ukraine. What distinguished these operations from the grinding frontal assaults of the previous years was their sophistication. Konev worked closely with Zhukov, Stalin's master strategist, who coordinated operations across multiple fronts. The plan was not to smash directly into German positions everywhere at once, though Soviet forces surely possessed the strength to do so. Instead, Soviet planners identified specific sectors where German formations were weakly held or where the terrain provided opportunities for breakthrough. Konev's role was to coordinate concentrated attacks at these points, to exploit any success ruthlessly, and to maneuver his reserves to sustain momentum while denying the enemy the ability to establish coherent defensive lines. The mechanics of these operations revealed Konev's growing mastery of operational art. Soviet commanders, learning from German models and from their own painful experience, increasingly used combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, artillery, and mechanized forces in coordinated assaults. An offensive would begin with artillery barrages of unprecedented density, sometimes involving tens of thousands of guns firing simultaneously to devastate enemy positions across a defined sector. Behind this artillery storm, carefully positioned corps would attack in waves, with mechanized reserves held ready to exploit breakthroughs. When German positions broke, Soviet armor and motorized rifle units would pour through the gaps, spreading destruction across the depth of German deployments and cutting lines of supply and retreat. The Germans had pioneered this form of warfare years earlier. Now the Red Army was beginning to perfect it, adapting the lessons of German success and reshaping them through the lens of Soviet military theory and Soviet industrial capacity. What made Konev's command of the Steppe Front transformative was his ability to maintain these operations across vast distances and for extended periods. Earlier Soviet operations had often run out of momentum within days, crippled by logistics problems, command confusion, or the simple fact that advances were advancing faster than supplies could follow. Konev understood that to sustain operations across Ukraine and into southern Russia, he needed to think constantly about supply lines, repair facilities, fuel depots, and the thousand small details that allowed an army of hundreds of thousands to function across devastated terrain. He developed sophisticated systems for managing logistics, coordinating with Soviet rail authorities to establish supply routes, and ensuring that advances were paced not faster than the supply system could sustain. This was not glamorous work. It involved endless calculations about tonnages of food and ammunition, the capacity of roads and rail lines, the positioning of depots, the coordination of transport. Yet it was the unglamorous foundation upon which all the spectacular advances rested. The advance through Ukraine in the autumn and winter of 1943 and into 1944 demonstrated Konev's elevation to the highest tier of Soviet commanders. German forces, still possessed of considerable fighting power, attempted to establish defensive lines along rivers and across terrain that might slow the Soviet advance. Konev's response was to attack these positions not frontally, but to maneuver around them, using the vast resources at his command to threaten German forces with encirclement. When Germans tried to establish positions along the Dnieper River, Soviet forces crossed it at multiple points and established bridgeheads that grew inexorably wider. When Germans attempted to hold fortified cities, Soviet forces bypassed them or encircled them, forcing costly surrenders or the abandonment of the positions. The speed of advance increased as winter transitioned into spring. By the spring of 1944, Konev's forces had retaken vast territories and were approaching the borders of Poland and Romania. The coordination required for these operations was extraordinary. Konev was not simply commanding his own front in isolation. He was operating within a larger strategy, orchestrated by Zhukov and Stalin's general staff. Multiple Soviet fronts were advancing simultaneously across a front line that stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers. Each front had to coordinate its movements with the others to prevent German forces from reinforcing threatened sectors or counterattacking into exposed flanks. This coordination was achieved through constant communication, the movement of liaison officers, and a shared understanding of the strategic objectives. Konev proved adept at this coordination, able to work effectively with other commanders without ego conflicts that might have fragmented Soviet operations. This was not mere congeniality. It was the mark of a commander sophisticated enough to understand that personal advancement required the success of the larger operation. The political dimensions of commanding the steppe front were equally significant as the military challenges. Stalin exercised direct oversight of military operations, receiving daily reports and sometimes intervening in decisions that in other armies would have been purely within the domain of field commanders. Konev had to maintain Stalin's confidence, while also demonstrating enough independence and operational success to establish his credibility as a commander of the first rank. He had to deliver victories that pleased Stalin while also ensuring that his forces did not suffer catastrophic casualties that would provoke Stalin's wrath. He had to navigate the personalities of other senior commanders, some of whom were his competitors for Stalin's favor. This required constant calculation, the ability to communicate upward effectively, and the political sense to understand that military competence alone was insufficient for advancement in Stalin's system. By the spring of 1944, as Konev's forces approached the borders of Poland and Romania, his transformation was complete. He had entered the Steppe Front Command as a competent operational commander who understood how to orchestrate large formations. He was emerging as one of the architects of Soviet military strategy at the continental scale. His mastery of supply and logistics rivaled his mastery of combat operations. His ability to coordinate with other commands and with the military leadership was sophisticated. His political acumen had carried him through the treacherous waters of Stalin's military hierarchy. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that he could sustain large-scale offensives across vast distances for extended periods, moving hundreds of thousands of troops in coordinated fashion while maintaining the initiative and denying the enemy the ability to establish stable defensive lines. This was the capstone of his development as a commander, the proof that he could think and act at the strategic level. The victories of the Steppe Front were not clean or easy. Soviet forces suffered significant casualties, sometimes through battles of attrition against German forces that fought desperately for every position. Supply lines were stretched thin. Coordination sometimes broke down, leading to tactical errors or missed opportunities. The advance was sometimes slowed by weather, by exhausted troops, by the sheer difficulty of moving across devastated terrain. Yet despite all of these complications, the fundamental momentum was maintained. Soviet forces kept advancing. German forces kept retreating. Territory that had been under German occupation for years was liberated and brought under Soviet control. The balance of power in the war shifted further in favor of the Soviet Union. The significance of Konev's command of the steppe front extended beyond the immediate military victories. In demonstrating that he could manage large-scale offensive operations, he had established himself as indispensable to Soviet strategy for the final phase of the war against Germany. The focus of Soviet military attention was beginning to shift westward, toward Germany itself. If the Red Army was to carry the war into German territory and achieve the conquest of Berlin, it would need commanders capable of orchestrating continental-scale operations. Konev had proven that he was such a commander. This recognition would inform the decisions that Stalin and his military leadership would make in the coming year, decisions that would place Konev at the center of the final campaigns of the war in Europe. By the time the steppe front's offensive operations of 1943 and 1944 concluded, Konev stood at the apex of the Soviet military hierarchy. He had proven himself not merely as a tactical commander or even as an operational commander of a single army. He had proven himself capable of managing the vast, complex machinery of modern warfare at the scale that mattered for the outcome of the war itself. He had learned to think in terms of hundreds of thousands of troops, distances measured in hundreds of kilometers, and operations sustained across months. He had mastered the integration of multiple arms of service, the management of logistics, the coordination with higher strategic direction, and the political dimensions of command in Stalin's system. The provincial officer who had joined the Red Army during the Russian Civil War had become one of the most powerful military figures in the Soviet Union. That power would soon be tested in operations that would reshape the map of Europe. By 1944, Ivan Konev had become something the Red Army rarely produced, a commander who learned faster than his enemies could adapt. The brutal schools of Rzhev and Kursk had transformed him from a capable tactician into a strategist capable of orchestrating operations across hundreds of kilometers of contested terrain. Yet the real test of his evolution lay ahead, in the mud and snow of Ukraine, where the German army still held substantial forces and the landscape itself seemed designed to defeat large-scale maneuver. This campaign would reveal whether Konev could sustain offensive momentum across devastated territory, maintain supply lines that stretched to breaking point, and coordinate the movement of millions of men through a region that had already suffered 5 years of warfare and occupation. What unfolded was not a single battle, but a cascade of interconnected operations that, taken together, announced Konev's arrival among the Soviet Union's greatest commanders. The geographic stage was forbidding. Ukraine in 1944 remained partially under German control, a vast expanse of burned villages, destroyed infrastructure, and terrain that ranged from dense forest to open steppe. The Red Army had liberated much of Ukraine already, but the Germans still held significant portions of the western regions, particularly the areas around Lviv and the approaches to the Carpathian Mountains. Konev's assignment was clear in its strategic intention but daunting in its complexity: drive the Germans from Ukrainian territory, prevent them from establishing a consolidated defensive line, and accomplish this while managing the mechanics of supplying an army that would eventually number in the hundreds of thousands across increasingly stretched lines of communication. The distances involved were staggering. From his starting positions to the final objectives stretched more than 400 kilometers through terrain that offered little natural advantage and every natural obstacle. Winter was receding, which meant mud, The Rasputitsa, that had slowed operations countless times before, would soon transform every road into a test of logistical endurance. Konev's approach reflected the hard-won lessons of years of warfare. Rather than attempt a single massive hammer blow, he orchestrated a series of coordinated offensives designed to compress German forces into progressively smaller spaces. This was operational art, refined through repetition and failure, a method that relied on precise timing, disciplined corps commanders, and supply arrangements that worked with the clockwork regularity that Soviet operations now increasingly demanded. Konev positioned his forces so that advances in one sector would force German responses that would create vulnerabilities elsewhere. A breakthrough here would be exploited there. Encirclements that began as tactical operations would expand into operational-level envelopments that could trap entire German formations. This required not just courage from frontline soldiers, but genuine intellectual mastery from the commanders coordinating movement across vast spaces where communication could be interrupted, where subordinates made autonomous decisions that cascaded into strategic consequences. The winter campaign of 1943 to 1944 had set conditions for this offensive, but the transition from winter to spring warfare presented its own challenges. Cold had preserved roads and rivers in frozen states that made movement predictable. As temperatures rose, water became both obstacle and opportunity. Rivers swelled with meltwater, potentially blocking advances but also providing defensive positions for German forces. Konev had to time his operations not just according to enemy positions and strength, but according to the transformation of the physical landscape itself. Nowhere was this more critical than along the Dnieper River and its tributary system. These waterways could serve as natural defensive barriers, where German forces might consolidate, or they could be crossed so rapidly that German forces would have no opportunity to organize resistance. Konev chose the aggressive path, pushing his subordinates to cross not once, but multiple times, each crossing expanding his bridgeheads and fragmenting German defensive positions. One of the defining characteristics of the Western Ukraine campaign was Konev's use of mechanized formations in a landscape where tradition suggested infantry should dominate. Soviet tank brigades and mechanized corps moved with a speed and coordination that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. This reflected not just improved vehicles, though that was part of it, but the sophistication of Soviet operational planning and the quality of junior commanders who had themselves learned through survival and adaptation. Konev's cavalry formations operated with the mobility of armored forces, while infantry supported rapid mechanized advances and consolidated positions after breakthroughs. The synergy between different arms had become the substance of Soviet operational doctrine, and in Ukraine, Konev demonstrated this integration at a scale that impressed even German observers who had pioneered such combined arms tactics themselves. The German defensive strategy throughout this period was constrained by the strategic situation that faced Nazi Germany more broadly. Berlin could not reinforce Ukraine with sufficient forces to prevent Soviet advances, nor could Hitler approve strategic withdrawals that would improve the German military position, because such withdrawals conflicted with Nazi ideology and political calculation. This left German field commanders like Model and Manstein in an impossible position, forced to fight with insufficient forces against an enemy whose attacks came from multiple directions and whose reserves seemed inexhaustible. Konev exploited this situation with a methodical ruthlessness. Where German commanders expected a breakthrough to be contained and counterattacked, Konev had already begun the exploitation phase, pushing reserves through the gap before German defenders could even establish a secondary line. Where German forces attempted to hold cities and strongpoints, Konev's operations were designed to bypass such positions rather than assault them, leaving German garrisons to be reduced by following formations while the main body of Soviet forces pressed forward. The human dimension of this campaign remained profound, though often obscured by the scale of operations. Soviet soldiers, many of them Ukrainian, were advancing through their own country, but often found it unrecognizable, scarred by occupation and warfare. Villages that had been thriving communities before 1941 were reduced to foundations and rubble. Forests had been cut bare. The agricultural landscape that had fed much of Europe was in places burned black. Konev's soldiers advanced through this devastation, knowing that many were displaced persons themselves, individuals who had been evacuated or conscripted from the very regions they were now liberating. This added layers of emotional complexity to what was, at the strategic level, a campaign of maneuver and logistics. Men fought harder in places they recognized, places that held memories from before the war. They also encountered the aftermath of German occupation in ways that hardened resolve and crystallized conviction about the justness of their cause. Konev's coordination with Zhukov during this period reveals the sophistication of Soviet high command planning. The two marshals operated not in competition, but in complementary operations designed to support the broader strategic objective of defeating Germany and establishing Soviet control over Eastern Europe. While Konev pushed operations in Ukraine, Zhukov was coordinating campaigns further north, ensuring that German forces could not be relocated from one theater to reinforce another. This required communication among Soviet commanders that had itself evolved dramatically since 1941. What had once been a system of constant interference from Stalin and the Stavka had evolved into a system where senior commanders had operational autonomy within strategic parameters established at the highest levels. Konev, once a junior figure seeking to survive, was now trusted with independent operational command, on a scale rivaling any general in any army in the world. The supply situation tested the limits of Soviet logistics in ways that earlier campaigns had not, moving hundreds of thousands of troops, maintaining adequate ammunition and fuel supplies, and managing the evacuation of wounded across distances of 400 kilometers required a level of organizational sophistication that the Soviet system had not always demonstrated. Yet by 1944, Soviet logistics had improved markedly. The Americans were providing trucks and supplies through Lend-Lease. Soviet production had recovered from the devastation of 1941 and 1942. Most importantly, Soviet commanders had learned to think logistically, to understand that operations succeeded or failed on the basis of whether supply lines could sustain the pace of advance. Konev had internalized this lesson through bitter experience at Rzhev and had built his operational plans around logistical realities rather than tactical hopes. The capture of Lviv in 1944 stood as a symbolic moment in the campaign, a major city liberated from 4 years of German occupation. Yet for Konev, the city itself mattered less than what its capture represented operationally. The rupture of German defensive structures in western Ukraine and the establishment of Soviet forces in territory from which further advances towards Central Europe could be staged. Lviv was not the climax of the campaign but a waypoint, a position from which subsequent operations would be launched. This perspective, focusing on operational consequences rather than the symbolic value of terrain, was characteristic of Konev's maturity as a commander. Earlier in the war, Soviet commanders had often fought for cities with desperate intensity, treating symbolic locations as strategic objectives. Konev had learned to subordinate symbolic considerations to operational logic, fighting for positions because they enabled future advances rather than because they carried prestige. By the end of 1944, Konev's forces had reached the Carpathian Mountains, the natural boundary between Ukraine and Hungary, between Soviet-controlled territory and German-occupied Central Europe. This achievement, accomplished in campaigns spanning nearly the entire year, represented the physical destruction of German military dominance in the region and the establishment of Soviet positions from which winter offensives could be launched toward Budapest and the German homeland itself. The campaign had cost heavily in Soviet casualties, yet it had also inflicted devastating losses on German forces and disrupted any possibility of German defense in depth across multiple lines. German formations that might have been reconstituted and repositioned had instead been broken in place, their fragments scattered across devastated territory. What the Western Ukraine campaign ultimately revealed was Konev's transformation from a capable operational commander into a strategist whose vision encompassed not merely the defeat of German forces, but the reshaping of entire regions. His operations in Ukraine were not disconnected from the broader Soviet strategy for post-war Europe. By liberating Ukrainian territory and establishing Soviet military dominance in the region, Konev was simultaneously implementing Stalin's vision for Soviet security and Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe. This fusion of military operation and political objective was characteristic of Soviet command at the highest level and reflected how completely Konev had been integrated into Stalin's system. Yet Konev's role was not merely political subordination. He possessed the military expertise to execute these strategies with sufficient ruthlessness and efficiency to accomplish their objectives. He was trusted not because he was politically compliant, but because he was militarily competent. By 1945, Konev would stand ready to launch the final offensives that would bring Soviet forces to Berlin and seal the fate of Nazi Germany. The Western Ukraine campaign had prepared him for this role, not merely through experience, but through the cultivation of an operational method that had proven successful across varied terrain and against increasingly desperate German opposition. His forces had learned to move at speed, to maneuver with precision, to sustain themselves across extended lines of communication, and to coordinate complex operations involving hundreds of thousands of troops. These capabilities, developed and refined in Ukraine, would now be directed toward the final destruction of German military power and the establishment of Soviet dominance over the European continent. By the beginning of 1945, the Soviet Union stood at the threshold of victory, yet the path to Berlin remained contested and uncertain. Marshal Ivan Konev, now commanding the First Ukrainian Front, faced a moment that would define not only his legacy, but the entire character of the Soviet advance into Central Europe. The winter offensive he was about to launch would demonstrate the full maturity of Soviet operational art, the product of 3.5 years of brutal learning on the Eastern Front. Behind him stretched the terrible fields where millions had fallen. Ahead lay Germany, weakened but still capable of inflicting grievous casualties. Konev understood that the coming campaign would be measured not merely in territorial gains, but in the speed and efficiency with which Soviet forces could traverse the frozen landscape and reach the gates of Berlin itself. The stakes extended beyond military glory. Stalin watched every movement, every success, and every failure with the calculating eye of a supreme commander who rewarded victory and punished hesitation with equal severity. The offensive was born from a calculation of resources, timing, and geography, refined through years of costly experimentation. Konev's First Ukrainian Front controlled roughly 1,200,000 troops, organized into multiple armies equipped with tanks, artillery, and supporting aircraft. The logistics supporting this vast force represented a triumph of Soviet industrial capacity and organizational discipline that would have been unimaginable in 1941. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers, fed by rail networks that had been repaired and extended behind the advancing Soviet armies. Every ton of ammunition, every liter of fuel, every ration of food had been accounted for in meticulous planning that involved thousands of officers coordinating movements across a front more than 300 kilometers wide. The German forces opposite Konev's front totaled perhaps 450,000 men, spread thinly across fortified positions they had been constructing throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. The numerical advantage belonged to the Soviets, but advantage alone had never guaranteed success in this war. What mattered was how that advantage was applied. The terrain itself demanded careful consideration and precise coordination. The landscape between the Vistula River, where Soviet forces held bridgeheads west of the river after the autumn campaigns, and the Oder River, some 200 kilometers distant, was a patchwork of frozen agricultural land, forests, villages, and scattered urban centers. Winter conditions meant that movement would depend on roads and frozen watercourses. Thaws could transform the entire battlefield into a muddy trap that would immobilize vehicles and slow infantry. Konev had witnessed the power of winter warfare during the Moscow counteroffensive of 1941, but he had also learned its limitations during the grinding failures at Rzhev. The weather of early 1945 was relatively cold and dry, offering a narrow window for rapid movement before the spring thaw would close that window forever. Konev recognized that speed was not merely advantageous, it was essential. The faster his forces moved, the less time the Germans would have to reinforce their positions or execute an orderly retreat to prepared defenses. German forces were also moving reinforcements toward this sector, drawn from other fronts where German resources were being stretched to the breaking point. The operational plan itself reflected the lessons Konev had absorbed from his experiences at Kursk and in the subsequent offensives through Ukraine. Rather than a single, massive breakthrough on a narrow front, a tactic that had often left Soviet forces vulnerable to German counterattacks, the offensive would employ multiple penetrations across a broad front, each designed to support the others and prevent German reserves from being concentrated at any single point. The 4th Ukrainian Army would strike toward the town of Kielce, the 13th Army would drive northward, and the 5th Guards Army and 8th Guards Army would push toward the critical breakthrough point near the city of Lodz, with the intent of racing westward toward the Oder. Supporting these forces would be the 2nd and 4th Air Armies, which would provide close support and attempt to disrupt German air operations and supply lines. Cavalry and mechanized corps were positioned for rapid exploitation of any breakthrough, their task being to drive deep into German rear areas, disrupt communications, and prevent the enemy from establishing coherent defensive lines. This was operational art refined through bitter experience, carefully orchestrated movements designed to achieve concentration of force at decisive points, while maintaining flexibility to exploit opportunities as they emerged. On the 12th of January 1945, Konev issued final orders and the offensive began. Soviet artillery opened a bombardment of unprecedented intensity, with thousands of guns concentrating their fire on German defensive positions across a narrow frontage. The ground itself seemed to shake with the concussion of explosions, a prelude to the infantry assault that followed. Waves of Soviet soldiers advanced across the frozen earth, supported by tanks that churned forward through the snow, their machine guns adding to the destructive power focused on the German defenders. The Germans fought with the courage born of desperation, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly bereft of air support as Soviet aircraft maintained near-total dominance in the skies above the battlefield. German reserves, drawn from other sectors and from damaged divisions reconstructed through rapid reinforcement, were thrown into the battle to try to stabilize the situation, but the sheer weight of the Soviet assault gradually wore down their resistance. Konev, commanding from his headquarters, received reports of breakthrough after breakthrough as his corps and army commanders executed the operational design with precision. The phrase that would echo through Soviet command channels was frontal breakthrough, but Konev's interpretation of that concept had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple attrition. As the first week of the offensive unfolded, Soviet forces began to achieve operationally significant penetrations. The German front, initially solid, began to fracture under the sustained pressure and weight of Soviet assaults. Konev fed his reserves into the breakthrough zones, enlarging the gaps in the German line and turning local successes into operational opportunities. Soviet mechanized corps began to move through the penetrations, racing toward the German rear with orders to seize bridges, disrupt supply lines, and prevent the orderly conduct of German defense operations. These corps, composed of highly trained personnel and equipped with tanks and self-propelled guns, operated with a speed and coordination that reflected years of learning how to conduct deep penetration operations. German attempts to contain these Soviet thrusts were hampered by their own lack of mobility and the difficulty of concentrating reserves against multiple threats. Konev demonstrated a tactical flexibility that had been absent in some earlier Soviet offensives. When German resistance hardened at one point, he would order pressure increased at another point where the defense was weaker. This constant shifting of focus prevented the Germans from ever establishing a stable defense line. The race for Warsaw emerged as a critical element of the operational plan, though not necessarily because the city itself was the primary objective. The German garrison defending the city had been ordered to hold it to the last man, and the city's location on the east bank of the Vistula made it a natural strong point. However, Konev understood that German forces committed to holding Warsaw would be forces that could not be used to defend the approaches to the Oder further west. He therefore ordered his forces to bypass the city where possible, while maintaining pressure to fix German defenders in place. Soviet forces swept around Warsaw in a vast encirclement, driving westward and leaving behind secondary forces to contain the garrison. This decision, born from operational calculation rather than compassion, meant that the people of Warsaw would suffer further days of bombardment and siege, but from Konev's perspective, speed toward the Oder had to take precedence over capturing terrain that, while symbolically important, was not the critical objective. The capture of Warsaw would eventually fall to Soviet forces under Zhukov's command, but Konev's front pressed onward toward the Oder with relentless momentum. By the 20th of January, merely 8 days into the offensive, Soviet forces had advanced more than 100 kilometers in some sectors. The speed of this advance shocked not only the German High Command, but also Stalin and the Soviet General Staff in Moscow. Konev's armies were moving at a pace rarely achieved in previous operations, sweeping across the frozen Polish countryside with remarkable coordination. German defensive positions that had been prepared over months were bypassed or overwhelmed before they could be properly manned. The German commander-in-chief on the Eastern Front, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner attempted to organize a coherent response, but the scale of the Soviet breakthrough and the lack of German reserves made effective counteraction impossible. German forces were compelled into rapid retreats, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to avoid encirclement. Soviet columns raced forward, their commanders under orders to maintain momentum, to seize river crossings ahead of German demolition teams, and to push relentlessly toward the Oder. The atmosphere within Konev's headquarters was one of controlled excitement. Everyone involved recognized that Soviet forces were achieving something remarkable, an operational success of genuine strategic significance. By the end of January, Soviet forces had reached the Oder River, achieving the offensive's primary objective in less than 3 weeks. The speed and completeness of the breakthrough represented a vindication of the operational planning and a demonstration of the Red Army's evolution into a sophisticated military instrument. Soviet forces had advanced roughly 200 kilometers on a front that now extended over 400 kilometers in width. German forces had suffered devastating losses in personnel and equipment, with many divisions cemented into destroyed towns or trapped in pocket envelopments that would require weeks to clear. Most critically, Soviet forces now stood at the doorstep of Germany, with some advanced units positioned fewer than 85 kilometers from Berlin. The psychological impact on Germany was profound. The idea that the Red Army had moved so swiftly and penetrated so deeply into Polish territory shattered any remaining hope that German forces could restore a stable defense line. Konev's armies had seized numerous river crossings, giving the Soviet high command options for the next phase of the advance. The bridgeheads across the Oder were still being expanded and consolidated, but the principal operation, the rapid advance from the Vistula to the Oder, had been achieved with remarkable success. The Vistula-Oder offensive also revealed something essential about Konev's development as a commander. He was no longer the officer struggling to survive under Stalin's purges or learning basic operational concepts during his tenure at Rzhev. The commander who had fought in the ice and snow near Moscow and endured the grinding battles of Ukraine had been transformed into something new, a strategist capable of orchestrating enormous military formations across vast distances with precision and speed. His capacity to coordinate the movements of multiple armies, to make rapid decisions about the allocation of reserves, and to exploit breakthroughs as they emerged, demonstrated a mastery of operational art that placed him among the finest commanders in the Soviet Union. Zhukov, Stalin's principal military advisor, recognized Konev's achievement, though the relationship between the two men remained one of professional respect tinged with rivalry. Both understood that the advance on Berlin would be the ultimate test, and both recognized that the forces now positioned along the Oder would determine the final character of the war in Europe. Konev had established himself not merely as a successful commander, but as an architect of strategic victory. The logistical achievement underlying the operational success deserved recognition equal to that given to the tactical and operational brilliance. Soviet supply services had maintained unbroken supply lines to formations advancing more than 200 kilometers across devastated terrain in winter conditions. This feat reflected the maturation of Soviet military organization, the training of thousands of supply officers, and the capacity of Soviet industry to produce the material required for such a massive operation. German logistics, by contrast, were increasingly fragmented and disrupted, with Allied air attacks on German rail networks and Soviet air attacks on German supply columns, creating chronic shortages of fuel and ammunition. The disparity in logistical capability had become as decisive as the disparity in numbers, and Konev understood this reality as thoroughly as any officer of the period. The advance to the Oder was therefore not simply a triumph of courage or tactical skill. It was a triumph of industrial capacity, organizational discipline, and the capacity to sustain military operations at the maximum intensity for extended periods. As Konev's forces consolidated their positions along the Oder and prepared for the final assault on Berlin, the political dimensions of the campaign became increasingly apparent. Stalin had been watching the progress of Konev's offensive with intense interest, and the success achieved had elevated Konev's standing in Soviet leadership circles. Yet this elevation in status came with increased complexity. Zhukov, commanding the Soviet forces striking from the east, was also preparing for the assault on Berlin, and the competition between the two marshals for the privilege of capturing the German capital would shape the final phases of the war. Konev had emerged from the Vistula-Oder offensive as the architect of one of the most successful Soviet operations of the war, a commander who had demonstrated the ability to blend speed with precision, boldness with careful planning. The advance to the Oder had positioned Soviet forces for the final victory, and Konev stood at the center of that achievement, ready for the battles that would determine not only the outcome of the war, but the shape of Europe in the decades to come. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union stood on the threshold of absolute victory. The Wehrmacht had been driven back across Poland and into the German heartland itself. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival on the steppes of Russia had transformed into an unstoppable advance toward the enemy's capital. Yet as Soviet forces closed on Berlin, the relationship between the two men responsible for this triumph began to fracture along invisible lines of ambition, rivalry, and the unforgiving politics of Stalin's court. Ivan Konev and Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's two greatest military commanders, found themselves positioned not as allies, but as competitors. The prize was Berlin itself, and the honor of capturing it would determine more than military glory. It would shape the pecking order of Soviet power in the post-war world, with consequences that neither man could fully predict. Konev had spent the winter of 1944 into 45 consolidating his command of the First Ukrainian Front, a formation of staggering size and complexity. His armies extended across a front stretching more than 300 kilometers, controlling territory from the Vistula River deep into Silesia and Upper Silesia. The Vistula-Oder offensive, which Konev had orchestrated in January, had brought his forces to within a stone's throw of Berlin itself. He had proven beyond doubt that he possessed the operational sophistication to manage armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, to coordinate their movements with precision, and to deliver victory on a scale that rivaled anything in Soviet military history. Yet success had not earned him the singular prominence he sought. Zhukov remained Stalin's master strategist, the man closest to absolute power after the dictator himself. Konev understood that one more triumph, the seizure of Berlin, might elevate him permanently above his rival, or at least establish him as an equal in the Soviet pantheon. The political calculus behind this rivalry was as dangerous as it was unspoken. Stalin reveled in competition among his subordinates, viewing it as a mechanism to prevent any single commander from accumulating enough independent authority to pose a threat. The dictator allocated glory and disgrace with the capriciousness of an ancient emperor, rewarding success one moment and inventing failures the next when it suited his purposes. Both Zhukov and Konev had survived the Great Terror through a combination of competence, loyalty, and ruthless self-preservation. Both understood that in Stalin's presence, yesterday's hero could become today's corpse if the winds shifted. The race to Berlin was therefore not merely a military competition, but a struggle for position within a system where position itself determined whether a man would live to see the peace or disappear into the machinery of suspicion and execution. Neither commander could afford to lose, and both recognized that the very nature of the competition itself was a kind of test administered by Stalin, who watched from Moscow with a calculating eye. When Stalin issued his directive on the 1st of April 1945, defining the boundaries between the First Belarusian Front under Zhukov's command and the First Ukrainian Front under Konev's command, the dictator seemed to be extending an invitation rather than issuing an order. The demarcation line was drawn with deliberate vagueness around Berlin itself. This was intentional. Stalin was not yet ready to decide which commander would deliver the ultimate blow. Instead, he was inviting them to race, to prove through action who was most capable of taking the prize. Zhukov's forces were positioned to the east and north, having crossed the Oder River and established bridgeheads on the western bank. His route to Berlin was the most direct, but it was also heavily fortified, with German defences concentrated precisely where Soviet forces would need to push hardest. Konev's forces, to the south, faced a slightly longer approach, but the German defences in his sector were thinner, offering the possibility of a faster breakthrough. The geometry of the situation created genuine uncertainty about which commander might actually reach Berlin first, and this uncertainty was precisely what Stalin intended. Konev studied the maps with the intensity of a man who understood that everything had come down to this single moment. His forces were poised along the Neisse River, having driven the Germans back to their last natural barriers before the final approaches to Berlin. His generals pressed him with questions about the timing of the offensive, the allocation of reserves, the deployment of artillery. Konev understood that conventional frontal assault, the straightforward application of overwhelming force, might not be sufficient. The Germans, though they were beaten, still possessed enough will to resist in the streets of their capital. If Konev attacked directly and met fierce resistance, Zhukov's forces might exploit the delay and break through from the east first. Konev therefore began formulating an operational plan that emphasized speed, breakthrough, and exploitation, rather than the grinding attrition that had characterized so many previous Soviet offensives. He would punch through the German lines with concentrated force, then drive deep into the German heartland, racing westward to seize Berlin before Zhukov's armies could break through from the Oder. The rivalry between the two commanders was not purely personal, though personal elements surely existed. Both men had contributed to Soviet victory, and both harbored frustrations about recognition and authority. Zhukov, older and more closely associated with Stalin, possessed the advantage of the dictator's obvious favor. Yet Zhukov's path was also harder militarily. He faced more heavily fortified positions and stronger German resistance. Konev, younger and hungry to prove himself, saw in the April offensive his opportunity to surpass his rival not through flattery or political maneuver, but through superior operational execution. The thought that he might sweep past the German defences, burst toward Berlin, and arrive at the city's gates before Zhukov had solved the problem of the Oder crossings. This possibility sustained Konev through the exhausting final weeks of preparation. Stalin's directive had created exactly this competitive dynamic, and Konev intended to exploit it to the fullest. The question of which army group would strike Berlin was more than a matter of military honor. Control of Berlin meant control of the narrative of victory. It meant the prestige of being first into the German capital, of claiming the symbolic heart of Nazism for Soviet arms. It meant having the primary role in accepting the German surrender and establishing Soviet military authority in what would become the Soviet occupation zone. For Konev, it also meant establishing unambiguously that he was not merely Zhukov's subordinate, but an independent commander of comparable or superior capability. The men beneath him understood what was at stake. His army commanders and corps commanders organized themselves for an assault of historic proportions, moving into attack positions with a sense that this final offensive was different from all the others. This was not simply another Soviet victory in a series of victories. This was the moment that would determine the shape of the post-war Soviet military hierarchy, and therefore the shape of Soviet power itself. As April advanced toward the final assault, the operational picture became clearer. Zhukov's forces would assault the German positions along the Oder, which were formidable. German General Gotthard Heinrici had positioned forces in depth, and the broken terrain of eastern Germany favored defensive operations. The assault across the Oder would require careful planning, massive artillery preparation, and careful coordination of assault forces to achieve success. Konev's sector, by contrast, offered the possibility of breakthrough through superior positioning and maneuver. The German forces opposite him were stretched thin, allocated to reinforce the desperate defense opposite Zhukov. If Konev could pierce the German line cleanly and drive forward with sufficient momentum, he might encircle Berlin from the south and southwest before Zhukov's assault from the east had fully developed. This was the operational logic that animated Konev's planning, and it was reinforced by Stalin's implicit permission to race his rival. The relationship between these two commanders was built on mutual recognition of competence, combined with wariness and barely concealed antagonism. They had fought together against the Wehrmacht for nearly 4 years. They had learned from each other, coordinated their operations, and developed sophisticated understanding of Soviet operational art through the crucible of actual warfare. Yet they also understood that Stalin had constructed his system in such a way that ultimate preeminence could belong to only one man. Zhukov, having reached that position first, would naturally resist any attempt by Konev to displace him. Konev, however, sensed that the final victory was within reach, that one more brilliant campaign might accomplish what years of distinguished service had not. The psychology of the competition was subtle and dangerous. Both men understood that excessive ambition could be self-defeating, that appearing too eager to outshine a rival could trigger Stalin's suspicion. Yet both also understood that the spoils of final victory would be distributed to those who grasped them forcefully. Restraint and modesty could be fatal to advancement in such circumstances. The first week of April brought the final preparations. Konev coordinated with his subordinate commanders to ensure that the assault on the Neisse would achieve maximum penetration with concentrated forces. He positioned his best units, the Guards, armies and mechanized corps, in attack formation. He accumulated vast quantities of ammunition and fuel. His artillery commanders organized the destruction of German defensive positions with meticulous precision. The logistics network, which had been tested across thousands of kilometers of Soviet advance, was now stretched to the limit but still functioning. Konev positioned himself to oversee the opening assault, knowing that the first hours would determine whether his operational concept would succeed. He understood that he needed to achieve breakthrough within the first day, that rapid exploitation was essential, and that any delay would allow Zhukov's forces to consolidate their assault positions and potentially break through first. The human element of this competition was significant, though largely invisible to outsiders. Konev was not simply a military automaton executing orders, but a man with ambitions, frustrations, and a keen understanding of power. He had survived the terror by maintaining a low profile and performing his duties with competence. Now, in victory, he wished to step into the light, He wished for recognition that he was more than Zhukov's subordinate, that he possessed independent capability and strategic vision. Yet he also understood that showing such ambition too openly could be dangerous. Therefore, his pursuit of the prize had to be expressed through military excellence, through the superior execution of operations, rather than through direct competition or political maneuvering. This made the approaching offensive not merely a military campaign, but a test of everything Konev had learned about survival, command, and advancement in a totalitarian system. The stakes were as high as they had ever been, which was saying something for a man who had commanded armies facing the Wehrmacht. By mid-April, as the moment of assault drew near, Konev felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. He was no longer simply a commander executing his duties, but an actor in the final act of the greatest war in human history. His decisions in the coming days would shape not only military outcomes, but his own place in the pantheon of Soviet power. Stalin was watching from Moscow, waiting to see which commander would demonstrate the superior capability to finish the war. Zhukov, his rival, was preparing his own assault, confident in the dictator's favor, but aware that military accidents could happen, that breakthrough could be achieved by the man with the sharper vision and faster execution. Konev moved through the final preparations with a sense of grim determination. He had learned the art of war through 4 years of catastrophe, struggle, and hard-won success. Now he would apply everything he had learned in a final race against time, geography, and his most dangerous rival. Berlin beckoned, and Konev intended to reach it first. By mid-April in 1945, the Red Army stood poised at the threshold of its final reckoning. Berlin lay ahead, no longer a distant objective, but a tangible prize within reach. For Ivan Konev, commanding the First Ukrainian Front, the moment embodied the culmination of 4 years of relentless struggle, from the chaos of Barbarossa through the grinding attrition of Rzhev and the vast operational victories that had carried Soviet forces across half a continent. Yet the path forward remained fraught with complications that had nothing to do with German resistance and everything to do with the internal politics of Stalin's war machine. Konev understood that the capture of Berlin carried weight beyond military significance. It represented vindication, power, and proximity to Stalin himself. The stakes extended far beyond tactical success, into the realm of post-war influence and personal survival within the Soviet hierarchy. The offensive had begun in mid-January with the Vistula Oder operation, a masterpiece of coordinated assault that had driven Soviet wedges deep into German territory. Konev's forces had advanced with startling speed, crossing frozen rivers and navigating terrain transformed into a maze of rubble and frozen earth. By early February, his spearheads had reached the Oder River, the natural barrier guarding Berlin's eastern approaches. For 2 months, the lines had held relatively static as Konev consolidated his position, brought up supplies across the devastated Polish landscape, and prepared for the final push. During this period, he had watched with keen awareness as Georgy Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front to the north, received what appeared to be Stalin's favor and the primary assignment for Berlin's capture. This recognition stung. Zhukov had been Stalin's principal strategic advisor throughout the war, the man most closely associated with the great victories, and their relationship carried a personal dimension that Konev, however brilliant, had never quite equaled. The political dimensions of military command in Stalin's Soviet Union could never be separated from actual operations. Konev had learned this lesson in 1,000 small ways across the preceding years, in the carefully worded reports that omitted inconvenient details, in the competition for resources disguised as military necessity, in the subtle jockeying for position within the vast Soviet command structure. Now, as the war's conclusion approached, that political dimension intensified. Stalin had not explicitly forbidden Konev from attempting to reach Berlin. He had simply assigned primary responsibility to Zhukov. For a commander of Konev's ambition and capability, this arrangement was intolerable. Konev resolved to position his forces in such a way that Berlin could be taken from the south, by his own First Ukrainian Front, thus demonstrating to Stalin that operational capability and proximity to the dictator's ear were not identical. This determination shaped every decision he made in the weeks preceding the final assault. As April arrived, Konev received the orders to begin the final offensive. His forces, numbering roughly 2 million men, distributed across multiple armies with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, faced German defenses that had grown progressively weaker as the Reich collapsed under assault from multiple directions. Yet German soldiers and their commanders still fought with discipline born of desperation and fanaticism. They had constructed multiple defensive lines south of Berlin, fortified positions anchored on towns and natural terrain features, garrisoned by units that ranged from hardened SS formations to Volkssturm militia of dubious combat value. On the 16th of April, Konev's artillery opened a barrage of unprecedented intensity, thousands of guns firing simultaneously in a crescendo designed to shatter both German fortifications and the nerve of their defenders. The ground trembled, the sky filled with smoke and the sharp reports of ordnance. This was Soviet warfare perfected through years of brutal education. Maximum firepower applied with ruthless precision against designated targets. The assault waves that followed the artillery preparation crashed against German positions with mechanical efficiency. Konev's commanders, battle-hardened operators who had learned their trade through survival in the crucible of the Eastern Front, coordinated movements of corps and divisions with sophisticated timing. Infantry advanced in dense formations, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns that moved forward in coordinated bounds. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Red Army now. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a meaningful force. Konev's forward observers, positioned to watch the developing battle, reported steady progress. Resistance varied. Some positions crumbled quickly as German defenders, recognizing their situation as hopeless, surrendered or fled. Other strongpoints, particularly those held by SS units or by commanders determined to inflict maximum casualties on their attackers, fought with fanatical intensity. The Soviet forces paid in blood for every kilometer of advance, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Konev established his command post near the front, a mobile headquarters that moved forward as the battle progressed. This was his characteristic approach, to remain close enough to observe the tactical situation directly, to sense the rhythm of the battle, and to make adjustments based on first-hand information, rather than relying entirely on reports filtered through chains of command. He understood that modern warfare, even at the massive scale of operations involving millions of men, ultimately turned on thousands of small decisions made by officers and soldiers in contact with the enemy. His role was to shape the conditions that allowed subordinate commanders to succeed, to allocate resources where they would have maximum effect, and to maintain forward momentum even when tactical complications threatened to slow the advance. In the devastated landscape surrounding Berlin, where German defense lines crumbled and reformed in patterns dictated by geography and availability of reserves, Konev's operational sense proved decisive. The physical terrain itself became a character in the drama. The approach to Berlin crossed ground transformed by 4 years of intermittent warfare into a nightmare world of rubble, burned villages, and frozen waterlogged fields. Roads had been rendered nearly impassable by retreating German forces and the sheer volume of Soviet traffic. Bridges had been destroyed, rivers lay in the way, and the logistical burden of supplying 2 million men across such devastated territory tested the sophistication of Soviet supply operations to their limits. Yet Konev's staff had prepared for these obstacles. Engineers worked around the clock to construct makeshift crossings. Supply columns, organized with almost mechanical precision, brought forward ammunition, fuel, and provisions in sufficient quantities to sustain the offensive. By the 21st of April, forward units of Konev's First Ukrainian Front had reached the suburbs of Berlin from the south. The race that Konev had conceived as both military necessity and political statement was reaching its conclusion. The final assault on Berlin itself unfolded across multiple days as Soviet forces fought through the city's outer districts toward the center. This was urban warfare, on a scale rarely seen, block by block fighting in a city of several million inhabitants, now reduced to rubble and desperation. German defenders, including SS units, Hitler Youth formations, and regular Wehrmacht soldiers, made their final stand in buildings that had been reduced to skeletal remains. Konev's forces, equipped with assault rifles and submachine guns, ideal for close-quarters combat, advanced with trained efficiency born of experience in the brutal reduction of Soviet cities and German towns alike. The human cost remained substantial. Soldiers died clearing apartments and basements, in alleyways and subway tunnels where desperate Germans made their final stands. Yet the outcome was inevitable. By the 25th of April, Soviet forces from Konev's First Ukrainian Front had linked up with forces under Zhukov's command in the heart of the city. Berlin was surrounded, trapped, finished. The political implications of Konev's success were not lost on Stalin or on Konev himself. While Zhukov had in fact led the primary assault from the east, meeting less organized resistance because the Germans had committed their remaining reserves to the south against Konev's advance, it was Konev's forces that had achieved the breakthrough that ultimately encircled the city. Stalin received reports of Konev's performance with apparent satisfaction. The dictator had not committed himself entirely to Zhukov's hands. He had allowed space for competition, and Konev had used that space to extraordinary effect. In the hierarchy of Soviet power, this moment marked Konev's elevation to the absolute first rank of commanders, no longer Zhukov's subordinate or secondary figure, but an equal architect of final victory. This recognition would shape his post-war trajectory and his position within Stalin's inner circle. As German forces surrendered and Adolf Hitler, ensconced in his final bunker, took his own life rather than face capture, the war in Europe moved into its final hours. Konev coordinated the mopping up of remaining German positions, the processing of vast numbers of prisoners, and the restoration of order in conquered territories. His forces, having advanced further and faster than any Soviet military formations in the entire war, now held enormous tracts of Central Europe and possessed the logistical capability to maintain control over these territories. Konev's responsibility expanded beyond pure military operations into the administration of occupation, the enforcement of Soviet will, and the implementation of Stalin's vision for a Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. The burden was immense, but it was also a burden of power and influence that Konev had earned through his operational success. The fall of Berlin and the surrender of German forces in early May 1945 marked not merely the end of the war in Europe, but the transformation of Konev from a military commander into a political actor with immense authority over conquered territories and millions of people. He had arrived in Berlin not as a conqueror seeking personal glory, but as a Soviet officer executing Stalin's will and protecting Soviet interests. Yet the performance itself, the operational excellence that had brought his forces to the gates of the German capital and broken through German defences when Zhukov's assault from the east encountered stiffer resistance, had marked him as indispensable. Konev understood, with the clarity that only a survivor of Stalin's system could possess, that competence alone did not guarantee safety or advancement, but competence demonstrated in proximity to the center of power, at moments of supreme importance, created the conditions for both survival and influence. The conclusion of the Berlin campaign closed one chapter of Konev's remarkable life and opened another. The ideological certainties and martial ambitions that had animated him in earlier years had been tempered by experience into something harder and more pragmatic. He had witnessed the Red Army transformed from a force of revolutionary enthusiasm into a machine of extraordinary sophistication and power. He had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of Stalin's favor, never certain of standing, always aware that yesterday's hero could become tomorrow's victim. The assault on Berlin in mid-April 1945 represented the apex of his wartime achievement, the moment when his operational brilliance, his political acumen, and his ruthless determination had aligned to produce a result that was simultaneously militarily decisive and politically advantageous. As German forces laid down their arms and Europe confronted the reality of Soviet victory, Konev stood among the architects of that victory, his position secure and his influence growing as the Red Army prepared to garrison the continent it had conquered. The guns fell silent across Europe in May of 1945. The Third Reich lay in rubble, its leadership either dead by their own hands or captured and waiting for judgment. For Ivan Konev, the moment arrived not as a conclusion, but as a threshold. The Soviet Union had paid an incalculable price for victory. More than 27 million dead, entire regions reduced to ash and bone, a nation that had endured the worst that modern warfare could inflict. Yet from that suffering came something Stalin had never possessed before: the undisputed military dominance of Eastern Europe. Konev stood at the center of this new reality. At 50 years old, weathered by 4 years of continuous combat command, he had become more than a general. He was the architect of the Soviet advance that had carried the Red Army from the gates of Moscow to the heart of Berlin. His reward came swiftly and with unmistakable clarity. Stalin elevated him to the highest echelons of Soviet power, granting him authority over vast territories and millions of soldiers who would shape the continent's future. The immediate task confronting Konev was one of staggering complexity. Germany lay fractured into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. But this orderly arrangement concealed a fundamental transformation occurring beneath the surface. The wartime alliance that had united these nations against a common enemy was already fragmenting. Where Soviet forces held ground, Stalin intended to maintain Soviet control, regardless of what had been promised at conferences in Tehran or Yalta. Konev found himself commanding not merely an army of occupation, but the instrument through which Soviet ideology would be imposed across Eastern Europe. He oversaw the consolidation of Soviet power in Austria, parts of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and the eastern half of Germany itself. His armies numbered in the millions, supported by vast supply networks and administrative machinery. The scale of responsibility eclipsed anything he had managed during wartime operations. Then, the objective had been clear: destroy the German army and seize Berlin. Now, The objectives were contradictory, ambiguous, and perpetually shifting based on Stalin's calculations of security, ideology, and Soviet advantage. Demobilization presented the first and most immediate challenge. Soviet soldiers who had fought since 1941 were exhausted, traumatized, and emotionally spent. They had survived combat across thousands of kilometers, endured winters that killed as surely as bullets, and lost friends and comrades in numbers that defied comprehension.